God. This means that they have a special mission. They're not just a regular country. You can argue where this comes from. Does it come from the Byzantine legacy? Does it come from just being a big country? There are many different theories about where it comes from, but what's not in dispute is that it's been there a long time and is still there today. But point number two is that although this aspiration of being a providential power has been clear for a long time, Russia has never been the greatest power in the world. There have been moments in time when Russia has had a significant position. The defeat, for example, by Peter the Great of Charles XII of Sweden, which is how Russia got onto the Baltic Sea. In the early 18th century, the defeat of Napoleon by Alexander, and Alexander got to Paris, for example. And of course, the defeat of Hitler by Stalin in World War II. Other than these three peaks, Russia has not quite been as powerful as it aspires to be. So the result has been a gap, actually a gulf, between the aspirations and the wherewithal, the capacities of the Russian state. So this has led Russia time and time again, while holding these aspirations and while not fully having the capacities to live up with them, to live up to the aspirations, it's led Russia time and time again to have recourse to the state as an instrument to push the society, to push it in terms of some type of economic modernization that's coercive, a kind of state-led drive to make up the difference, or at least to manage the gap with the most powerful countries. It's taken different forms. There was a Tsarist version, there was a bloody, very coercive Soviet version, and there is a version today under President Putin that we would recognize. Once again, not identical throughout time, but enough similarity to recognize a pattern. This recourse to the state as an instrument, the state as a lever to push and kind of bully the society forward towards some type of modernizing project, has produced time and again a spurt, a kind of economic spurt, and then a period of stagnation. The spurt is always followed by stagnation. So you get this recourse to the state, which looks like it's going to work, and for a time does produce some results at high cost, nonetheless then gets into a kind of bogged down quagmire situation. The fourth and final piece of this historical excursion is that the recourse to the state, the attempt to build a strong state, produces again and again personal rule. It doesn't produce a strong state, it produces a personalistic state. One of the things you probably don't know is that Vladimir Putin goes on Russian television and complains endlessly that only about 20% of his orders are implemented. The rest are circumvented, ignored, buried in bureaucratic red tape, because personalistic rule is not as strong as we think it is. State actors are not as easily controlled in authoritarian regimes, and the more you build up the state in an authoritarian setting, the less control you have over the state officials, ironically enough. So you have aspirations to be a providential power, serious capacities, but not always the first rank in states, a recourse to the state as an instrument to force the country to try to close this gap with the most powerful countries, and then personalistic rule. And the personalistic rule, the problem with that is a conflation between the national interests and the survival of the personal regime. So to criticize the personal regime is to criticize Russia. There's this conflation between national interest and personalistic rule survival. That's the period we're in yet again. So in some ways, Putin is as much a symptom as he is a driver of the current state of Russia. The implications of this should be clear, Our bad relations with Russia are not accidental. They don't derive, for example, from a, quote, misunderstanding. If we respected them more, if we understood more what they were about, relations would be good. The answer to that is no. Relations, when was the last time there was a sustained period of good relations between the United States and Russia over more than a generation into a second generation? When was the last time that happened? That's correct. Before the United States became a great power, there was a sustained period of good relations. Of course, Professor McDougall got it right. How surprised are we at that? Since the U.S. has been the leading economy in the world, which dates to about 1890s, maybe even before, relations have not been good. They've been poor. There's a fundamental clash of interests between the United States and Russia. U.S. grand strategy looks very complicated, but it's not that complicated. It can be boiled down as follows. Do not allow another country to dominate its region. What that means is that no country, not Germany, not anybody else, should be able to dominate Europe. No country, not Japan, and now not China, should be able to dominate East Asia. And no country, not Russia, should be able to dominate Eurasia. Well, what's Russian grand strategy? Russian grand strategy is dominate Eurasia. So there's a fundamental clash of interests between U.S. grand strategy and Russian grand strategy. There's also, even below that, a fundamental clash of values. The highest value in Russia is respect for the state. The highest value in the United States is freedom, often understood as freedom from the state. So not only is there a clash of interests, but there's a clash of values even deeper than the interests. So we would expect relations to be difficult. That doesn't mean they have to be warlike. That doesn't mean the tension has to be as high as it is now. Because differences, even differences of values, can be managed. That's called, for example, marriage. Everybody in this room is familiar with the problem of managing a clash of interests and a clash of values even before your kids are teenager age, right? And so we can manage better, but the idea that we can get to a friendly place with Russia has been a constant illusion, not because Russians are bad people, right? They're an incredible civilization. Their civilizational achievements are stunning. But there's a fundamental clash of interests and a clash of values, right? Which leads to difficult relations time and time again. We saw President Trump discover this. Before President Trump, President Obama went through this cycle and problem. President Bush, before him, went through this, and on it goes. Okay. So that's my first general point. Right? So it's not only Putin, and it's not even primarily Putin. There's something deeper going on there. But once again, that doesn't mean that they're an enemy forever or that we're always right. It just means that we need to manage the tensions, and we could be doing a better job. All right, area number 2 of my talk. As I said, I'm going to do 3. Now I'm going to do the paradoxes of Russian power right now, and then do a final third area, much briefer, on U.S. policy vis-a-vis Russia, if that's okay. All right. Okay. Yeah. So you hear a lot that Russia is weak, that Russia is very weak. But of course, this is the natural state of Russia. It is one of the great powers. It's just never the greatest power. You can recall the Soviet Union, and we thought, oh, the Soviet Union collapsed, we're done with the Russia problem. Well, it turns out we're not done with the Russia problem, even though the Soviet Union collapsed, right? Because they are weak, or weaker, but they are still a major power. If you look at, for example, GDP, Russia's GDP, which is maybe 1.3 trillion, 1.4 trillion at current exchange rates. If you look at Russia's GDP, it's only a little bit more than 1/15 the size of the US GDP. 1/15. The Soviet Union's GDP at peak was 1/3 the size of the American economy. Still not gigantic, but can you imagine going from 1/3 to about 1/15? That tells you that Russia is not really on the same level as the United States. At the same time, you can look at other indicators. Obviously they have a military-industrial complex. Yes, it's been inherited from the Soviet Union, so a lot of it is not credited to the current regime, but nonetheless it has been revived under the current regime. And they're able to produce world-class weaponry of all different types, and they're able to do that even when they have budgetary austerity. So there's something effective and successful about the Russian state. We think of the Russian state as a pure kleptocracy. It's a bunch of crooks and gangsters and thieves, and they steal everything in sight. That describes a large part of Russian reality, but not all. Many people predicted, for example, that the sanctions would crash the Russian economy, that the oil price, when it dropped, would crash the Russian economy. And there they are, still there today, still investing in their military-industrial modernization, the military-industrial complex. And the reason is because they have also not just kleptocrats, but many competent people in the state. Their central bank is competently run. Their finance ministry has a tremendous number of competent people. Their macroeconomic policy over the last 20 years has been excellent since the 1998 default. It's been just excellent. And so we have to take account of these paradoxes. On the one hand, a tiny economy compared to the US economy. On the other hand, the ability to produce weapons, in fact, to sell them globally, right, and to use them, that are high class. On the one hand, thieves and crooks, a kleptocratic state. On the other hand, a highly competent central bank and a highly competent finance ministry. They also have something we don't have. They have a State Department. Their foreign ministry is excellent. It's full of people who know foreign languages, have experience of other countries, and go into meetings fully briefed and fully on their brief. So there's quite a lot of competence inside the kleptocratic chaos of the Russian state. So these are some of the paradoxes we don't fully understand. Right? Russia is smaller than ever, farther from Europe than ever, since Peter the Great's time. And yet, it's still in this geography of Eurasia, which means it touches on Europe, it touches on the Middle East, it touches on East Asia. And so Russia's geography is a great platform for influence projection. They have a unique geography. Russia doesn't have any allies, per se, and so it looks weak in that regard, a lonely power, but it's got one of the vetoes in the Security Council at the UN, which is why, time and again, Russia tries to push things into or through the UN, where they have significant voice. Of course, they earned that veto in the victory over the Nazi land army in World War II. So we can't seem to be able to manage this, the paradoxical nature of Russia. We paint it one way or the other way rather than both ways at the same time. And I could give you many statistics, all the averages about this and that and this and that. You know, averages are very valuable, right? If your head is in the oven and your feet are in the fridge, on average, you're comfortable. Right? You guys know that from your statistics class, way back when. I could do that with all the averages about Russia. But just the deeper point is that it is weak, and yet it's a major power. Or another way to put it, it's a major power, and yet it's weak. Right? This is the story of Russia. It has some unique attributes. One of the unique attributes is daring. Not recklessness, but daring. Russia does stuff, constantly surprising us. Right? daring. It's no use being a superpower if you behave like a wussy or an idiot. And it's quite useful if you're a weak major power, but you have a certain amount of daring and calculated risks. Okay, so a third point, U.S. Foreign policy vis-a-vis Russia, or U.S. foreign policy generally. The third area of discussion. I haven't really talked about the current administration. I think we'll leave that for the Q&A. There may be some people interested in that question, including, for example, relationships between the current president and people in Russia. I want to talk a little bit, given this audience, FPRI, I want to talk a little bit then about the foreign policy implications of some of what I'm saying. So to me, there's a deep paradox on the American side, which is to say we're very proud of our tradition of limited government at home. If they still taught civics, they don't teach civics anymore, but if they were still teaching civics, they would teach a story about the tradition of limited government, where it came from, the founding fathers, and the arguments at the Constitutional Convention and the formation of the United States and separation of powers, the checks and balances, and everything else, right? Things that I was taught just before they abolished civics for the next generations. Right? Anyway, but paradoxically, while we cherish the tradition of limited government at home, we sometimes forget about this when we talk about foreign policy. So if our idea is that too much power of any one institution or group leads to tyranny, how could it be that we want the United States to do everything alone and to dominate the whole globe? Isn't that a violation of our own principles, of our own traditions of limited government? Wouldn't it be smarter if we had a limited government theory in foreign policy terms, so that, like at home, we would be afraid of our own excess power in the international system? In other words, maybe it would be to our advantage abroad, just like it is at home, if our power were more limited. I know that sounds ridiculous, but if you think about American values, there is a certain logic there. What would that look like in practice? What it would look like in practice is what should be familiar to this audience, traditional, a balance of power notion about the world. You'd want a lot of friends, and you'd want to consult those friends. So you wouldn't want to engage in a trade war with somebody who's cheating a trade, not because that person is innocent, or that country is innocent. No, the Chinese are cheating a trade. But a trade war between the U.S. and China has very adverse effects on all of those countries that also trade and are U.S. allies. And I don't have to mention them, but you know, South Korea, Japan, Germany, right? They're all U.S. allies. And so they are potential victims of a trade war that we would inflict on the Chinese, even though the Chinese deserve that. So you would instead want to preserve your alliance and your deep relationships, and you'd want to address the problem of Chinese cheating in economic terms without victimizing one of your strengths, which is your alliance system. You have more than 60 allies, and the Chinese have North Korea as their principal ally, or formal ally, right? Anyway, so just to continue this further then with the Russian story. So it's very convenient, and by the way, as I said, it's true that it's a gangster regime. On the other hand, it's still there. It's not going away. The Soviet Union went away, and we're still confronting, as I said, similar problems. So what we need with Russia is some type of negotiation. We need some type of relationship. We need some type of managing of the tensions. And we have forgotten how one does this. That's not to say we ignore violations of human rights, murders of journalists. All of that remains part of our understanding and part of our policy. But nonetheless, you can't go through, have a stable U.S. foreign policy that's sustainable over generations, whereby you don't have any relationship whatsoever with Russia. So paradoxically, again, President Trump's instincts are actually pretty good on this. He believes, and he's actually correct, that we need to get to a better place with Russia. The problem is how we would do that. Here's where the rubber meets the road. So one of the things you'll hear is, well, we have to get tough on Russia. We got to be strong. We got to show strength. And that's correct. Those people who argue for deterrence, for strength, for standing up to Russia, they're correct. Of course, you have to recognize the limitations in a policy like that. For example, Russia has an army. Ukraine doesn't really have an army. So, are you going to defend the sovereignty of Ukraine? Are you going to make a statement publicly that you're going to defend the sovereignty of Ukraine? Because if you make that statement, you're going to have to send 250,000 American boys and girls to Ukraine for a long period of time to defend that sovereignty. So if you're going to make aggressive statements of deterrence or strength against Russia, your means better line up, right, with your policy announcements. It's one thing to not recognize Russian incorporation of Crimea, right? Russian annexation of Crimea, not recognize that. We didn't recognize Soviet annexation of the Baltic republics either, as you know. So our ambassador in Moscow couldn't go to Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania because the Americans didn't recognize their incorporation into the Soviet Union. Right? It's one thing not to recognize. It's another thing to talk about rollback or to talk about military confrontation. That's fine if you're ready to send 250,000 American boys and girls there to defend that sovereignty, because Russia, as I said, has a real army. And you say, well, we can arm the Ukrainians to fight themselves. You can do that, right? You can do that. Let's try that somehow. Of course, we can't arm them to the degree that the Russians are armed. And moreover, we can arm the Ukrainians to defend themselves. And then the train station in Kiev blows up. And a whole bunch of people die one day. And the Russians say, oh, we had nothing to do with that. We don't know how that happened. And the Ukrainians in their capital are afraid to take mass transit because somebody set bombs in their mass transit in response to arming of eastern Ukraine to defend itself against Russia. Right? So that's the kind of escalation one could get into. I'm not saying we shouldn't do it or we should do it. I'm just talking about we have to be aware of the implications of our public statements and about our proposed policies. So getting tough with Russia, standing up to Russia, has implications. Are we ready for those implications? Once again, I'm in favor of the deterrence, of being strong, and of getting tough with them. But I understand that maybe differently from the cable TV discussion version of it, where everything is cost-free, and Russia never responds and has no ability to escalate. Okay, let's turn to the other piece. Then you have some people saying, you know, Russia should be our friend. We should be more friendly with them. We should negotiate with them. And just like those who say we should get tough with Russia, I agree with that statement too. I agree completely that we should have a relationship with Russia of mutual respect and derive as much mutual benefit as we can for our own benefit, not because we want to be altruistic. But once again, the issue is how and in what form. Obviously, we need to combine the strength and the negotiation. Just to get strong and tough with somebody, and then what? You're tough with them, you impose some punishment on them, and then what happens next? Right? What happens next is you need a diplomatic negotiation so that if you're strong and they make concessions, you're ready to pocket the concessions. Our problem is we're neither getting tough with them in a smart way, nor are we in negotiations. Getting tough without negotiations is a dead end. And just negotiating without having any leverage is also a dead end. Think about the Obama administration. First, it wanted to get nice with Russia because it thought there was this misunderstanding that made the relations bad. This turned out to blow up in their face. The reset didn't work. Then they wanted to ignore Russia. And then Russia can't really be ignored because they have significant capabilities. And so they reminded the United States that they were out there. They interfered in our election process. Hello, we're still out here. You're trying to ignore us. You're trying to isolate us. We're just reminding you that we're still out here. One of the other pieces of the Obama administration policy that's not well understood is the negotiation that we had with Russia. So, for example, we wanted Russia to help in Syria, so we announced that we wanted Russia to help in Syria. Now, this put all the leverage on Russia's side of the table. We announced that we wanted to do a deal on the Iranian nuclear program, and we needed Russia for that deal. Once again, we pushed all our chips, all our leverage onto the Russia side. So while there were some negotiations in the Obama case, they were negotiations not from strength, but from weakness, and we gave what leverage we had over to the Russian side before the negotiations opened up, and of course we got nothing out of those negotiations. So the idea is, and this goes back to Reagan, by the way, it was during Reagan's presidency that I was the TA of President McDougal out there directly. This goes back to Reagan and Schultz, and it's not rocket science, but it is show some strength and negotiate at the same time, and then linkage of the strength of the negotiation, but not linkage of all the issues. So that if Russia, for example, murders a journalist, you break off negotiations. No, you make a statement about how this violates core principles of the international community, and you increase the pressure, but you keep the negotiations going because increasing the pressure gives you more leverage in the negotiation process. So this ability to kind of walk and chew gum, to apply our strengths, but also to have dialogue, right? To have diplomacy, or to have diplomacy that's backed up with the kind of advantages that a superpower would have. This is banal. Once again, not rocket science, but I just don't see that happening. All right. So in conclusion then, Washington right now is just not really capable of a Russia policy. We're sort of paralyzed for all the reasons that you understand. But if we were to get a Russia policy, if there were to be a Russia policy, it would involve understanding that the differences are not superficial but fundamental, yet they can be managed. It would involve understanding that Russia is weak but also a major power. And it would involve an understanding that we need to show our strengths in intelligent fashion, not overcommitting, while also using diplomacy, negotiation, right, to get those concessions and to pocket those concessions. Anyway, thank you for your attention this morning.
Thank you very much, Steve. We'll have a few minutes for questions. We have a couple of people coming around with microphones, so please raise your hand, and then we'll get the microphone to you. We have a question right here. Wait for the microphone.
Sir, thank you very much. It's a great lecture, one of the best I've heard, and I agree with you fully on practically everything. But I have two questions.
Okay.
All right. So one, you said that the Russians have developed advanced weapon systems.
Yes.
Can you name one that has been battle tested and shown that it does operate? I know they claim a lot of weapon systems that advanced, but so did Khrushchev said that they're putting out missiles like rockets, like sausages, but it turned out to be that they were all out of papier-mâché. So now, lately, I think President Trump called them bluff, and they did not show that their weapon systems are working. And the second question is, so that you mentioned Crimea, but I think you didn't mention that we were one of the guarantors. We guaranteed
Yes, we
that
did.
Ukrainian borders were not going to be violated, and when they were violated, we practically didn't do anything.
Yes.
Thank you, sir.
Yes, I think the second point you raised, which is make fewer commitments, but uphold all the commitments you make. If you're not going to uphold a commitment, you've got to keep quiet. And we had a problem in 1956 in Hungary. There were ways in which we encouraged the uprising against communism behind the Iron Curtain in Hungary. And then when the Hungarians rose up, we all said, oh, who's responsible for helping the Hungarians? Did I say anything? I didn't say anything. Right? So you're right. If you make a commitment, as we did to Ukraine's territorial sovereignty, we were a signatory to that when they gave up the nuclear weapons, we need to uphold that commitment. Or we shouldn't have made that commitment in the first place. That goes for all the commitments currently on record and any new ones that we might make. On your point about Russia weapon systems, so they have 7,700 nuclear weapons. 7,700. We're not sure how many North Korea might have, but it's not 7,700. Moreover, Russia has intercontinental ballistic missiles that can exit Earth's atmosphere and re-enter without burning up. And we don't think North Korea has such a capability. And if they do, they can't have very many of them. But Russia has those missiles, and Russia could hit this ballroom, could hit this brunch, if they so decided accurately. Right? The missile wouldn't fishtail into the Sea of Japan, next to Japan if they send it. Right? So we can say that, yes, the F-16 is a superior plane. And then you could go down the whole arsenal. Which is superior? This is superior. Would you trade American weaponry for Russian weaponry? The answer would be no. Of course, you wouldn't trade it. You wouldn't trade it for Chinese stuff either, right? That's not the issue. The issue is just because your fighter jet isn't necessarily superior to the latest American fighter jet doesn't mean you don't have a good fighter jet. And that's what they do have. So if you look across the capabilities, air, sea, and land, right, there are gaps between U.S. and Russian capabilities, but those gaps are less than the gaps between Russian capabilities and other European partners, let alone Eastern Europe, Central Asia. Right? Russia has a formidable arsenal. They don't have what we have, but they have enough. And so we need to take into account that this is part of the power that they exercise in the world, even as we understand your deeper point is that our stuff is better.
Ed Snitzer on the side of the room. Wait for the mic.
Professor, what would be your policy towards Russia today if you were President of the United States?
Thank you for that scary thought, Ed. The idea of becoming President of the United States is daunting. But so we need to get to a better place with them. So what would that look like as a concrete example? So let's take Crimea. Crimea, it was stolen illegally and is under Russian occupation in international law terms, was annexed by Russia in an annexation that has not been widely recognized. You can argue that Crimea is going back to Ukraine the day after Texas is going back to Mexico. I would say that there's a possibility that it might go back after Texas goes back to Mexico. So the possibility of Ukraine getting back Crimea is not so high. So you say to yourself, okay, that's not something that we can get back very easily. Can we make something of that problem that Russia has caused, that violation of international law? And the answer could be that you will grant Russian recognition of annexation of Crimea over a 30-year period. And during those 30 years, they would have to perform certain tasks. For example, they would have to give up Eastern Ukraine. They would have to pull out of Eastern Ukraine, the Donbass and Lugansk. They would have to pull out of Abkhazia and South Ossetia in Georgia. They would have to pull out of Transnistria in Moldova. And then they would have to do the following with Assad in Syria. You could list a whole bunch of things that you would want to see them do. And moreover, you could make it a 30-year or a 20-year process so that during the course of that time, if they went back and cheated and did something that they promised but then took it away, you could say, well, I'm sorry, you're in violation. Moreover, you could make them pay monetary compensation for the annexation of Crimea, in addition to getting a stabilization on a whole lot of other issues. And so you say to yourself, but that would be wrong. That would be handing them, legalizing something that they stole. And it would be. But here's the thing about life. Right? Here's the thing about life. The Versailles Treaty in 1919, everybody says, well, the Versailles Treaty was a big mistake. It was a punitive treaty, and it was so punitive, it destabilized Germany, and it brought Hitler to power, and it was a mistake. And others say, oh no, the Versailles Treaty was fine, it's just the British shrank from enforcing it. If the British had had more resolve, it would have been okay. My answer to them is wrong on both accounts, because the Versailles Treaty was an anomalous period. It was the only time since 1870 that Germany and Russia were both flat on their back. And this was not going to last. Either Germany or Russia was going to be a great power again. And the Versailles Treaty was done against Germany without Russia. And so it was an impossible treaty that was possible only in that one moment of 1919. Think about that in 1991. The 1991 settlement was imposed when Russia was flat on its back and could do nothing about it. And we think it's inviolable. We think, the world inherited with the collapse of the Soviet Union, with the borders that were there and all the agreements, that's forever. Well, guess what? In the 1990s, Russia couldn't do anything about it. Now they can, and they are, and they will do more. So we can, if we want, try to hold 1991 in place, even as it's unraveling, and has unraveled in many places. Or we can recognize that it was an anomalous situation in 1991 when Russia was flat on its back. That anomaly has passed. We must deal with the fact that they are able to revise the 1991 treaty and are doing that, and it would be in our interests to take the lead and stabilize that process by extracting advantages rather than let Russia continue to revise 1991 while we're holding to an impossible situation. So you could argue that that's immoral, that doesn't uphold international law, and I would argue that, well, what's morality? Is morality committing to, for example, overturning tyranny in Iraq, making a mess of it, and then wanting to leave? Right? I mean, where does morality come in terms of your commitments and your ability to deliver on the commitments? Our gentleman mentioned that we didn't deliver on our commitment to Ukraine. We're in violation of that. There's no doubt that we are. And so the answer to that is either live up to that commitment at a cost that American society is not willing to bear right now, or revise those commitments to make them in line with our capabilities and the costs that we want to pay, and try to extract some benefits in a negotiation with that. So I don't know if it's a satisfactory answer, Ed, but thankfully they're never going to make me president.
We have time for one more question. John Medvekis.
Yeah. So about the Baltics, Russia and the Baltics. So let's imagine, John, that I want to steal your wallet. I'm a typical academic, right? I want to steal your wallet. And your wallet is in your pocket, and your pocket is zipped up. That's going to be tough for me to get that wallet out of your pocket with the zipper up, right? Let's call that NATO Article 5. But let's imagine that you put your wallet on the table, and you just leave it there in the middle of the table, and you turn around, you don't pay attention to anybody. And I want to steal your wallet. Well, am I going to take the approach of the wallet that's in the pocket all locked up, or am I going to take the approach of the wallet that's sitting on the table like a stick of butter? That's Russia with the Baltics. To the extent that we offer it up like a stick of butter in the middle of the table, they might do something. To the extent that we lock it up, pull that zipper, they're going to do something elsewhere where it's a lot easier than they are going to do it where it's a lot harder. So it depends in part on us. Right? Russia's forward policy, as we might call it in these places, forward policy, meaning right, offense is the best defense. They understand their security as being on the offensive, destabilizing the outside world. Right? Russia's not going to become part of the West, so let's make the West more like Russia. Right? That's the strategy in a nutshell. That only works. Right? That only works if you let them. You can't get away with that if, for example, the Baltics are well defended. If, for example, there are measures to counteract Russian behavior. So I don't think I'm not that worried about the Baltics as I am, for example, about many other places. But here's one thing do I have time to conclude?
Okay.
I want to conclude on this note. Right? We haven't really mentioned it yet, so I just want to make sure that we're clear on this. So at the very beginning of this problem, Russia interference, Russia, Trump, all of this kind of stuff, people were asking me, what's going on? What is this stuff about? How could this be happening? And it's very clear what happened. Right? Think about this for a second. You have a very sophisticated military intelligence and civilian intelligence operation. You want to discredit American candidates. You want to discredit American democracy. So what are you going to do? You're going to need the services of the Buster Keaton Trump campaign in order to pull this penetration off, right? You're going to need to collude with the Trump campaign because you're Russia. You're not good enough to pull this off on your own. You can't find a WikiLeaks as a cutout to release all this information so that you have deniability. Right? You need the Trump people to do all of this. So obviously, the idea of collusion is absurd on the surface. The Russians have never had any need for any collusion from the beginning. Moreover, the idea that the Russians knew or thought Trump was going to win is also absurd. On the Friday before the Tuesday election, the Trump campaign polling operation sent out an email bragging, that is a few days before the election, the Trump campaign sent out an email bragging that they would get as many as 250 electoral votes. They were bragging at how close their loss was going to be. That was the Trump internal polling organization. That was the Trump campaign. That's what they thought was going to happen. Right? So the idea that the Russians knew what they were doing, on the one hand, and therefore bet on Trump, right, but didn't know what they were doing on the other hand, and therefore they needed to collude with Trump. Right? There's been an absurd discussion in the U.S. public sphere about this. What the Russians did was they compromised the Trump campaign and the Trump people. They entangled them in criminal activities, and they penetrated them with surveillance to find out what was going on the inside. It was a Russian intelligence operation. The intelligence operation was also there on the Clinton side. The Clinton people were less willing, right? They were more unwilling victims of this. And the Trump campaign was, unfortunately, a willing victim of Russia's compromising, entangling them in criminality. Right? But the point was to penetrate and compromise, so the idea of collusion is ridiculous. Just think, first of all, it's not on the American statute books in any case. There is no crime called collusion in the statute books. But so what we have is a sophisticated Russian operation that the idiotic people in the Trump campaign willingly cooperated with and entangled themselves in compromising situations, subjecting the campaign themselves and maybe even the president to blackmail. So that's why this all started as a counterintelligence investigation, which then morphed into a criminal investigation. But the origins are a counterintelligence problem. That's what the Russians did. It was an intelligence operation of penetration and compromise. One final point, if I could make on this. Right? The other piece I noted at the very beginning of this, the absurdity of collusion is one piece. The other piece was that overpriced real estate is ipso facto money launderers. That's the business you're in if you're selling overpriced real estate. If you're selling a quote, luxury condominium with 1/1000th of a millimeter thick walls for $100 million, or how much per square foot, you can do the calculation. There's only certain kind of people who can buy that property or would be interested in that property. People who have stolen big amounts of money and buy overpriced real estate, parking their ill-gotten gains. So if any investigation of the Trump operation moved towards the business, they would discover the business was a criminal enterprise. Because once again, many people in the real estate business will not cross lines. They will do due diligence. They will look where the money comes from. They will decline some buyers because of the suspect nature of the money. That's, after all, what the law requires. But in this case, that organization did not do its due diligence and in many cases did the opposite. And so it was very vulnerable on the investigation if it went into the business area, which President Trump himself announced at the beginning, that it was a red line to look into his business operations. You'll recall that, right? So here we are now, confused as hell about collusion, which was a Russian entanglement in criminality on purpose that foolish people got involved in on our side. And moreover, now we're investigating the business operation where you have the money laundering, and the pincer movement is moving in. So you get the campaign manager, and then you move to the lawyer, and then you go for the son-in-law, and then the son and the daughter, until finally people break. And this is a standard operating practice. People break, and so we're in potential trouble here, not necessarily because President Trump, quote, colluded with the Russians, if you understand. The idea of the president, I don't even think that that's a crime, necessarily. For example, a back channel to the Russians, communicating with them. I don't think that's a crime in the United States, opening a back channel to another government that you want to talk to. I actually think that that's maybe even a good idea, let alone a crime, right? So we're in a kind of crazy situation now where what's happening behind the scenes, an investigation of the business criminality, which has little to do with the campaign necessarily, and we've lost the Russian intelligence operation that opened this investigation in the first place by the FBI a really, really, really long time ago. Anyway, thank you very much for your attention again.
Thank you. I'd like to thank Stephen Kotkin. It was a talk, it was a model FPRI talk giving insight into contemporary affairs through the lens of history, geography, and culture. Before you go, I would like to thank Susan Goldberg, the chairman of our Special Events Committee, Rachel Hemler, our event planner, and Eli Gilman, coordinator of all things at FPRI. Thank you for the great job each of you have done to make today's event such a great event. Finally, one more thing. Since Steve mentioned Professor McDougall, I should mention that on May 15th, McDougall will give the first annual Ginsburg-Sattel Lecture under FPRI auspices in co-sponsorship with the Museum of the American Revolution. This is the first annual lecture on American identity and character. This particular lecture will look at where did the founders get their ideas. So join us on May 15th at the Museum of the American Revolution.
In the late 1980s, a young Japanese couple were eagerly anticipating the birth of their first child and building successful careers. It should have been the beginning of a wonderful family, the start of a happy, long life together. But on one fateful day, a terrible event occurred that destroyed that future and sent ripples throughout the entire country that still disturb the people to this very day. This is the true, unsolved story of the Nagoya pregnant wife incident. Although most of my videos are quite intense in regards to their subject matters, I would say that this case is particularly high up in terms of its descriptions of viciousness and brutality, so please consider this your warning. If you're a returning viewer or someone new to the channel, welcome. I make videos on Japanese cases, strange, solved and unsolved. If that sounds like something you think you'll find interesting, please consider subscribing and turning on notifications. With my videos taking such a long time to make, your support really helps the channel grow. In any case, let's get on with the video. Sadly, almost no information is available about the victim of this case. Born on the 13th of February 1961, the 27-year-old Mitsuko Moriya lived in the city of Nagoya, Aichi Prefecture, together with her husband, 31-year-old Shinichi Moriya. They had been happily married for 3 years, and in March 1988, Mitsuko was in her final month of pregnancy. The husband Shinichi was working full-time at an undisclosed company while also supporting his spouse. The couple lived together in a then-new apartment in a small 2-story building in Tomidacho, within the area of Nakagawa Ward of Nagoya City. The two were excitedly waiting for the birth of their first child, a boy, and were described by others that knew them as living the ordinary but hopeful life of a young couple. Shinichi's career was going well, they had a nice home, and a baby boy on the way, everything a young couple aspires to have. Mitsuko wasn't working a regular full-time job due to her being in her late stages of pregnancy, but was working a small side job out of her apartment, where she organized the selling of household products such as deodorant and cleaning products for cheaper prices. Before online shopping and other similar modern conveniences, such businesses along with door-to-door selling were relatively popular in Japan and elsewhere. Along with her diligence to housework despite the physical challenges, she was clearly a very hard worker. From reading the limited details available, she seemed to have a cheerful personality too, even to the point of selling her side business products to friends, as you will soon discover later in this video. This very ordinary, simple life, however, would take a very dark, dramatic turn that none in their wildest dreams could have predicted. Friday the 18th of March 1998 was a slightly chilly day that began like any other for the Moriya couple. Shinichi got ready and left for work in the early morning, with Mitsuko seeing him off at the apartment door. Shinichi mostly drove his car to work, but didn't on this day, so it remained in the apartment complex car park while he set off on foot. It is unknown what Mitsuko did during the rest of the morning once her husband went to work, but it is believed she remained at home, relaxed a little, prepared for her side job duties, and took care of some daily household chores. Since Mitsuko was actually 5 days past her birth due date, something seemingly especially common for women and their first child, the couple were very concerned and excited about when it would happen, expecting Mitsuko to go into labor at any moment. Shinichi was a very caring and devoted husband, and so worrying about Mitsuko's condition, he would call the home from his workplace multiple times a day. Sometimes he would call to just say a few words like, "How are you feeling?" to confirm his wife was alright before focusing on his job again. Such non-job related calls during work time in Japan, especially back in the 1980s, were likely frowned upon, but nonetheless Shinichi called her habitually, which clearly displayed his love and support for his wife. Shinichi called his wife at around 1:10 p.m. when they spoke briefly about Mitsuko's condition, where she claimed to be fine. Shinichi noticed nothing out of the ordinary in her demeanor too, both in what she said and in her tone of voice. It was the same as always, and so there was nothing to be worried about at this time. A routine phone call like any other throughout the recent days, but this would be their last call. At roughly 1:50 p.m., one of Mitsuko's friends came to visit. The 30-year-old woman parked her car in the apartment building car park and went up to Mitsuko's apartment with her 3-year-old daughter. They were visiting from Kaniecho in Amagun, western Nagoya. She had brought some strawberries over as a souvenir to enjoy with Mitsuko. Gift-giving after going on a trip or visiting from somewhere else is a common custom in Japan, with people who take time off work to travel often bringing snacks from where they went back to the office, for example. The two friends chatted away happily as friends do while enjoying drinking tea prepared by Mitsuko and eating the strawberries brought by the guest. They spoke about childcare among many other things. The friend's young daughter also ate snacks and played in the apartment. They continued having a good time until around 3 p.m, when it was time for them to part ways. The friend was actually a customer of Mitsuko's side job too, and so bought 2,000 yen worth of products from her before leaving. They all left the apartment, and Mitsuko waved off her friend and the friend's daughter in the car park in front of the building outside. Things were cheerful and pleasant at this point. Nothing was strange or unusual, but that friend was the last good person to ever see Mitsuko alive. Shinichi tried calling a few more times during the day from the afternoon, but there was no response. He called over and over, but Mitsuko still didn't pick up. In total, he called over 10 times, the last call being at 6:50 p.m, just before he left for work to return home. Naturally, he was a little worried at this time, but thought to himself, when I arrive home, she should be there. He believed that perhaps she'd gone out. Shinichi hurried home quicker than usual that day, arriving at the apartment he shared with Mitsuko at around 7:40 p.m. He was surprised to find the front door already unlocked when he put in his key, something that never happened. He swung it open and discovered something else strange. All the lights were off, and so the apartment was completely dark with it being the late evening. Shinichi was confused and nervous, and called out into the apartment but received no answer. He sensed something was off, but turned on some lights and quickly went to the bedroom to change out of his suit into his evening homewear. When he was done and moved into the kitchen area in the center of the apartment, he heard something that he really didn't expect, something that made his heart stop. The soft, distinctive cries of a newborn baby. Shinichi, thinking that Mitsuko had given birth alone at home in an emergency, rushed into the living room and turned on the lights, illuminating a sight he and his father later described as a terrible situation normal people cannot imagine. I'd like to take this opportunity to once again warn you that the following is quite disturbing. I will avoid in-depth descriptions just in case. On the floor was Mitsuko. She was lying face up, with her hands bound behind her back against the floor. Around her neck was the kotatsu cord, still plugged into the wall. Surrounding her was a large red pool. Her clothes, a blue maternity jumper and a pink cardigan, had been moved up so her stomach was exposed. And from the top of the stomach down to the bottom was a 38cm vertical cut. Someone, a callous individual, had opened up Mitsuko's stomach with something sharp, removed the fetus, and left him lying in the damp pool at her feet. The baby, a son, was clinging to life and crying softly. But sadly, Mitsuko had her life cruelly taken from her in an utterly shocking way. An expecting mother, one of the most vulnerable people you can imagine, was the poor victim of a monster. Shinichi, utterly horrified at the terrible scene, ran to the landline telephone back in the kitchen to call 119, but the phone handset was missing. It had been cut from the cord and was nowhere to be found. Thinking quickly, he ran out of the apartment and to the floor below, the first floor, to call for aid. He rang the door of his neighbor, a housewife, and when she opened up, he said, "My phone handset has been cut off and my child has been born, so please lend me your phone." Shinichi didn't have time to explain properly, and according to the neighbor, his face was pale and he was clearly in severe panic. The neighbor let him use her phone, and although she could see things were desperate, she simply thought, "Oh, the baby has been born," because she was aware of the Moriya couple's situation, but she had no idea what actually had happened. At 7:43 p.m., Shinichi called the Nagoya Fire and Disaster Management Center from the neighbor's home, asking them to send an ambulance immediately. 3 paramedics, receiving a report about a child being born in an apartment, rushed down to the scene in an ambulance. One member brought utensils such as forceps and special scissors in order to deal with such urgent situations involving pregnancy and an emergency birth. They hadn't been given all the details due to the urgency of the situation, and so simply raced down without knowing much. They arrived at the scene and in the apartment, discovering the same sight that the husband had. Horrified, they quickly took to caring for the mother and child, but discovered something they really didn't expect. When they inspected the opening in Mitsuko's stomach, within they found the apartment's phone handset that had been severed from the kitchen, as well as Shinichi's car key, which had a Mickey Mouse keyring attached to it. After the twisted perpetrator had removed the son from the opening they'd made upon taking Mitsuko's life, they had shoved the items inside in a truly shocking act of brutality. The paramedics removed at least the phone handset and laid it down on the kitchen floor before taking Mitsuko down to the ambulance via a stretcher. The Aichi Prefectural Police were also contacted and came to the scene immediately. Veteran detectives, who had seen all sorts of horrors and had been specially trained to deal with such things, were reported as saying, "We have never seen such a scene as that," after witnessing the inside of the apartment. Mitsuko and the baby were taken to Nagoya Ekisaikai Hospital, where they confirmed officially that Mitsuko had sadly passed away. Her cause of death was asphyxiation, and it appeared that upon her passing, the baby was removed before the umbilical cord stopped providing oxygen, which is a very short window of just a few minutes. The baby was in a desperate situation. He had suffered 3 wounds on and around the left leg. It is believed these were sustained when the perpetrator had been opening Mitsuko's stomach with a knife. As a result, he had lost a lot of blood, but the boy's grandfather, Shinichi's father, offered his own for a blood transfusion, quickly providing much needed aid. Since he had been left on the floor for an extended period of time, he was showing severe signs of hypothermia. When brought to the hospital, his body temperature was only 30 degrees, and he was suffering life-threatening anemia and cyanosis. The boy was rushed immediately into an incubator to warm him up, and he underwent emergency surgery at once. Due to the diligence of the medical professionals in identifying physical issues, the quick blood transfusion from the baby's grandfather, and the thorough care during and after the hour-long surgery, the boy miraculously survived, requiring 15 days in hospital for medical treatment. Mitsuko's body underwent an examination through an autopsy to learn more about what had happened. As previously stated, the cause of death was asphyxiation, but the pattern of marks on the neck were inconsistent with the kotatsu cord, so it is likely that the perpetrator used something else before wrapping the cord around, maybe in an attempt to throw off the investigators. Mitsuko's black maternity stockings and maternity dress had not been disturbed or cut, and she had not been assaulted. She had no defense wounds, meaning that whoever did this likely caught her by surprise from behind and quickly took her life without allowing Mitsuko time to respond. From the autopsy, medical professionals estimated her time of death to be any time from 3 p.m. to 6 p.m., but hypothesized that it could be closer to 3 p.m. after examining her stomach contents and analyzing other factors. Given the horrible nature of the crime, local authorities quickly made this a top priority case and began a large-scale investigation immediately, interviewing locals and collecting evidence. The media quickly descended upon the scene too. Naturally, they began by interviewing the neighbors. There were only 4 apartments in the building. The one beside the Moriya couple was vacant, but the 2 on the first floor were occupied. The neighbor who Shinichi went to in order to call an ambulance, a housewife in her 30s, had a very strange story to tell. At around 3:10 to 3:20 p.m., roughly the same time that Mitsuko had gone to see off her friend in the apartment car park, the neighbor was alerted to the rattling noise of the doorknob to her apartment door. Someone was trying to get in. Suddenly the doorbell began ringing incessantly too. The neighbor went to the peephole and saw a man standing in front of the door. He was wearing a long coat and a black jumper, and given the appearance of what the neighbor described as being like a salaryman, he was likely in a black business suit too. He appeared to be in his 30s, 165 centimeters tall, was of average build, and had a round face. No sketch of the man was ever released, but the description sounds quite ordinary of the average Japanese man without any truly defining features. The housewife opened the door, and the unknown man said to the neighbor, do you know where the Nakamura family home is? Nakamura is a very common Japanese name, but there was no one with that name in the neighborhood, and the neighbor had no idea about the home he was asking for. The fact that he had come to her too, someone living in a tucked away apartment, was very confusing to her. The man's demeanor and aura were very strange. He was described as looking uncomposed, and was giving off a vibe the witness found quite disturbing and creepy. Uncomfortable and sensing something dark about the man, the neighbor quickly and firmly said, "I don't know," before swiftly closing the door, locking it immediately. The man left at once without saying anything more. She never saw him again. The authorities naturally felt that this was a very strong lead. He was acting bizarre, seemed to be a stranger, and was at the scene right at the time the medical professionals believed that Mitsuko had been murdered. The fact that he'd gone out of his way to go down through a narrow entranceway to an inconspicuous apartment made authorities believe that the man was checking in on them, seeing who was home and who wasn't, saying, the man may have been casing the rooms using the excuse of asking for directions. The authorities also interviewed Mitsuko's friend who had visited that day, the last innocent person to see her alive. She was naturally incredibly shocked after hearing what had happened, since they were happily chatting away that day and nothing was out of the ordinary. The friend also actually had something very important to say that ties to the neighbor's statement, however. While chatting away and having fun, the friend was startled because she suddenly heard the rattling of the door handle turning, as though someone was trying to open it. The friend alerted Mitsuko to the sounds, but Mitsuko dismissed it, replying with, "It's just the noise of the ventilation fan, isn't it?" She didn't seem concerned at all, and they carried on enjoying their time together because the sound had stopped. This cannot be a coincidence. Two completely independent people both mentioning the rattling of door handles, so clearly on that terrible day, someone was there, trying to open the apartment doors. As described by Shinichi, and as you will discover more about later on in the video, Mitsuko was a meticulous, methodical person. Ordinarily, she would always keep the doors locked. However, according to the friend, when Mitsuko went to see her off in the car park, she didn't lock the door behind her, since she would only be quick and standing in the apartment entryway. The timing of this coincides with the time when the neighbor had the strange visitor come to her door. During that brief moment, could the man have slipped into her apartment and waited for her to return when he pounced? The authorities examined the apartment lock and there was no sign of damage or picking, so it is certainly probable that he sneaked in during that brief window of opportunity. Another possibility is that the man waited for her to return to the apartment first, and then used the same excuse he used on the neighbor in order to get her to open the door, and upon seeing that Mitsuko was a heavily pregnant woman and therefore vulnerable, he decided that she would be an easy target and so struck. Several people claim they saw someone matching this strange visitor's description at Tora Station, roughly 500 meters away from the apartment. Around that area, some people came forward to say that they had also encountered a man going around apartments and homes suspiciously. He seemed to be searching buildings to determine if people were home, and upon encountering someone, he would ask questions about directions. At first, the police suspected that the man had been searching for vacant homes to burgle, so sent officers and interviewed over 400 people in the area, but sadly not a single lead came out of it. Some officers felt it was unrelated to the incident since asking for directions is a common trick used by criminals and nothing unique, despite the link to the neighbor's encounter. Another local claimed that at around 3:10 p.m, the exact time the neighbor encountered the strange man, a man in his 30s of average build ran out from the apartment building into the road, ran north to a crossing about 50 meters from the building, and then turned left where he disappeared from view. His appearance seemed to match the neighbor's description, but there are limited details about this, and it's unclear if it led the police anywhere. The friend revealed further details about what was discussed. As mentioned previously, the other apartment on the second floor, the one next to the Morios, was vacant at the time. Only 3 of the 4 apartments had people living in them. However, Mitsuko had revealed something concerning to the friend. She said, "The apartment next to mine is vacant, but I feel uneasy because I sometimes see a man I don't know going in and out." Could this man she spoke of have been secretly living in the vacant apartment? Some kind of vagrant who knew that Mitsuko was vulnerable and so waited for the right opportunity to attack? If it were the landlord or something like that, it would have been someone known to her. Strangely, it seems that once this incident took place, the authorities were not able to track down whoever it was. It seems that if someone was living or going back and forth between the location, they stopped once the murder took place. Some elementary school students who happened to be in the area at the time also had some information to tell. A 3rd year and a 5th year elementary school student local to the area said, "At around 4:30 p.m. on the day of the crime, we saw a suspicious man wandering around the scene, occasionally looking down as if peering at the house on the north side of the road. He was 37 to 38 years old and 175 centimeters tall. He was wearing a long black coat, no glasses, and a light brown hat like a beret. He was walking with his head down, his coat collar was turned up to hide his face, and he had his hands in his pockets." And another 5th year elementary school student returning from cram school said, "I saw a suspicious man wandering around the street on the west side of the apartment building for around 10 minutes. The boy saw this person at around 7 p.m, not long before Shinichi discovered his wife, and according to reports, his description of the man he saw matched the description given by the other students. The descriptions of this man by these school children is slightly different from that given by the neighbor, but there are some points that match, such as the rough age and type of coat. I personally think that the neighbor's tip is more credible and relevant to the incident, but the fact that the students' descriptions match each other despite being completely independent is, at the very least, intriguing. Another neighbor living nearby but not in the apartment building, a housewife, claimed she had spotted an unknown car parked in the apartment car park at around 2:30 p.m. It was unusual and noteworthy because the engine had been left running for a while despite no one being there. However, there's no indication that it was involved in the crime at all, and could even have been the visiting friend's car, misremembered and mistaken for being something more than it was. Naturally, the investigators also looked into Shinichi, the husband, as is typical of such cases. Some actually had their suspicions about him since, even though he noted numerous strange things like unanswered calls, the unlocked front door, and the lights not being on, he didn't check on his wife right away, and instead went straight to the bedroom to get changed, which was surprising considering the circumstances. You could argue that he thought Mitsuko was out or something, but because she was heavily pregnant, changing clothes after a series of red flags shouldn't have been the top priority, so some found this odd. However, he was not high up on the suspicion scale due to his strong alibi at the time as he was at work during the incident. He was cooperative during questioning and had a caring nature regarding Mitsuko, and he had received positive testimony from people that knew him. He was looking forward to starting his family and had a fantastic relationship with his wife. The couple had no financial or personal troubles between them, and her death arguably made his life more difficult because he was now a single father. While the authorities were going door-to-door interviewing locals, they also began a thorough investigation of the apartment. The knife used to open the stomach was not found at the scene, and had been brought and taken by the criminal. The perpetrator had not left any of their possessions at the scene either. Mitsuko's purse had also been taken, and the dresser had been ransacked. It is unclear if anything was taken from the dresser, but these actions told the authorities that burglary was one of the motives. Regarding the stolen purse and circumstances of the apartment, the Aichi Prefectural Police Force proclaimed that they were investigating this as a robbery-murder case, stating that they theorized a thief broke into the house, encountered the victim, killed her, and then something bizarre unexpectedly awoke within them. Some on the investigation felt the strange curiosity to do something so twisted suddenly came out of the person unexpectedly. The authorities discovered that the apartment had been carefully wiped clean. The perpetrator had gone to great lengths to remove any fingerprints from the scene. They had also washed their hands and likely the knife in the kitchen sink to destroy evidence and make it easier to leave the apartment without suspicion. None of the perpetrator's DNA was found either, and considering the physical acts they committed, it showed how careful they must have been. In 2003, a former senior official on the Special Investigation Unit on the case said in an interview with Mainichi Shimbun, "People focus on the bizarre aspects of the crime, like the opening of the stomach, but the careful destruction of evidence suggests it was a robbery. I suspect that the perpetrator's bizarre behavior was simply the manifestation of a hidden, abnormal side that revealed itself during the murder. Fortunately, the perpetrator did make one mistake. They had entered the apartment without removing their shoes, and had left a shoe print. The print had a shoe size of 25 centimeters, and interestingly was a counterfeit shoe of an undisclosed major brand, manufactured in South Korea and Taiwan, so a shoe foreign to Japan. The print had what is described as a squid tentacle pattern on it. Police tried tracing the root of the counterfeit shoes, but this didn't lead to any definite identification of the perpetrator, given how widespread and anonymous sales of such items are. With the lack of clues and careful actions after the crime, it is believed that the incident had been planned to a certain degree, at least the unlawful entering and burglary part, and was not some random, spur-of-the-moment act. It is also believed that only one person is involved. As for when the crime took place, there are a number of key points given by Shinichi and other things theorized by investigators. As stated before, Mitsuko was methodical and meticulous about everything she did in life. We've already spoken about the door and how she would always lock it when at home, but after using cutlery and tableware, Mitsuko would immediately wash them. However, the glasses and plates Mitsuko had used when her friend came to visit were left on the kotatsu, meaning that something must have happened immediately before she had time to clear things up. Whenever she had guests over, she would habitually take care of cleaning as soon as they left, so to leave them out like this was very out of character. And there's more to back this up. The laundry, which was always brought in immediately upon drying or nearly being dry, was left hanging outside on the balcony. By around the time the friend left, it should have been dry and ready to bring in and put away. What's more, at around 4 PM that day, a postman delivered a card to the address via the door's letterbox. He just posted the card before quickly moving on, and so didn't notice anything unusual. However, like the other points, Mitsuko was the type to never allow the post to accumulate, and would go get whatever came through the letterbox very quickly. Since you can easily hear the letterbox in these types of apartments, she should have noticed it immediately. There's also the point about the lights. When Shinichi returned home that night before discovering his wife and son, the lights were off and the apartment was very dark. Investigators believe that this is because the crime took place when it was still bright outside, and the lights were not needed. Of course, the perpetrator could have turned them off, but considering what they did and how long they lingered in the place, it doesn't feel like something they would bother or need to do. These things about her were so prominent and defining of her character that her husband and friends took note of it, so the fact that they didn't happen on that day really puts the time of death close to when Mitsuko's friend left the apartment after their chat. As the investigation to find out the details of what happened continued, Shinichi's son was recovering in hospital. The day after the incident, the 19th of March 1988, he started drinking formula, and 15 days later on the 2nd of April, his wounds and medical issues had healed enough for him to be discharged from hospital. Shinichi held a press conference at this time, stating, "The boy's name will not be made public, but because we knew he'd be a boy before he was born, I gave him the name my wife and I decided on when we discussed it together." He went on to state, "I want to do everything I can for this child, and for his mother, and raise him just like any normal parent." The head of the Special Investigation Headquarters of the Nakagawa Police Force would call Shinichi to encourage him. Shinichi really put his son as his top priority. These well-wishers are not to say that the authorities were completely done with looking into Shinichi. Suspicion was low because of his strong alibi, but doubt lingered for some reasons previously stated, and because of something at Mitsuko's funeral. In front of the police and press present, Shinichi said, "My wife liked wine, so let me pour some," before pouring a glass and offering it to the altar. The authorities felt that this action was extremely calm and performance-like for someone who should be grieving the loss of their wife. To them, it felt too staged and insincere. They thought that along with the actions he did at the apartment before discovering his wife hinted that he could at least be involved, even if not directly. Because of this, after reading a number of reports, some investigators didn't treat him so well. But as the investigation continued more and more and witness statements came in, he was ruled out in the end, and the investigation's focus moved away from him. They additionally questioned friends and family of the Moria couple, and all said they had a great relationship with no trouble between them that could possibly lead to such a thing happening. There was also no motive for him to do it, especially with a child on the way. While the lack of evidence they could go off made the investigation difficult, the authorities did try to piece together what they had to come up with some ideas as to who the person responsible could be. Given the horrible and despicable nature of the attack, they believe the person could have an extremely strong grudge against Mitsuko, Shinichi, or both of them. The fact that they could attack a heavily pregnant woman and end her life without hesitation and so quickly she couldn't resist shows they could have been driven by extreme anger. The perpetrator even had no consideration for the newborn son. Some people looked to the two items the perpetrator inserted into Mitsuko's stomach upon cutting it open. To remind you, one was the phone headset, and the other was Shinichi's car key with a Mickey Mouse keychain. This was a truly horrific detail to discover, but a few people have added further meaning onto them. The side business that Mitsuko and Shinichi were involved in, the selling of deodorant products and the like, was considered by some to be a multi-level marketing system, or pyramid scheme. In Japanese, pyramid scheme is known as nezumiko, or in a literal sense, mouse mutual assistance. People have commented that the Mickey Mouse keychain was some sort of sick joke referring to the business, and because much of it is conducted on the phone was also put into her. For this type of side job, it relies on inviting others to sell products too. If those people who are invited fail to sell well, however, they may end up losing a lot of money. There is zero evidence to suggest this, and honestly, I think this entire point is wild speculation with people reading way too much into it. But if Mitsuko had invited someone into the business and they happened to lose their money, it could have caused them to seek revenge against her. There are some counter-arguments against this theory though. If it were a crime of emotion, there likely would have been more evidence left behind, and more general chaos within the apartment. The criminal would have made mistakes in their frenzied, angry state. However, we know this is not true. The perpetrator seemed very calm and careful, and so some investigators believe that there is a professional feeling to this, almost as though the person responsible might have done something like this before. Another theory is something we've touched on already, that this was first intended as a robbery, but then some dark, disturbing thoughts unexpectedly awoke within the perpetrator and they let their twisted curiosity get the better of them. Heavily pregnant and young, perhaps the perpetrator thought she'd be an easy target. Burglary was at least partially a motive, seeing as Mitsuko's purse was taken and a dresser was rummaged through, and the person seems to be experienced given their care not to leave any evidence behind at the scene. Knocking on random doors and asking for something like directions is also a common practice by burglars to case out a location and determine if some property is left unguarded. The string used to bind Mitsuko's hands was also taken from the Moria home and was not something brought by the perpetrator, hinting that the confrontation with Mitsuko was likely unplanned. However, again, there are a number of points to counteract this too. The murder weapon was brought and taken by the perpetrator, so he had had a purpose with that at least. Whether they brought it to intimidate people and things unexpectedly escalated is unknown, but the fact that they had it at all suggests that the perpetrator had more than robbery on their mind from the get-go, and so these terrible acts they committed might not have been by chance. It also seems that the attack was immediate, given the lack of defensive wounds and how undisturbed the apartment was generally. Such a thing probably wouldn't have occurred if the attack was an afterthought during a robbery. It also doesn't feel like an accidental killing either, since wrapping a rope around someone's neck is usually only done for a singular purpose. One noteworthy point is the lack of assault that occurred. Mitsuko is described as being a very beautiful young woman, someone that could have even been a model, so some theorize that perhaps the perpetrator was motivated by disgusting desires to satisfy their urges. However, there was no sign of such a thing happening, not in terms of DNA, trauma, or disturbance to her clothing. Another theory is that it could have been committed by someone very young. Some have looked at the small shoe size and claimed that it could have been a child, and argued that the reason that they could commit such an unthinkable crime is because their lack of life experience meant that they were not yet empathic. However, given the very thoughtful actions of the criminal and the skill displayed in their deeds, most dismiss this theory. A theory brought forward by investigators was that the person responsible could have had some medical knowledge. They were even quoted as saying that they were proceeding along a line of investigation that assumed the perpetrator was an adult male with medical knowledge and an abnormal interest in pregnant women. The 38cm cut had been made with a very thin blade, likely a box cutter, and had been traced over the same place 2 or 3 times. This precision showed that it wasn't a cut made by someone crazed, but rather by someone calm, who knew a little bit or had some experience about what they were doing. Someone like a medical student or even a new doctor. There's more too. Although it seemed Mitsuko officially passed while or after the baby was removed, her fate was already sadly sealed well before then. Normally a fetus can only survive for 10 to 15 minutes after a mother has passed unless the umbilical cord is cut so the baby breathes on its own. That means that the fetus must have been removed very quickly after the attack. According to the then head of the gynecology department of Sanraku Hospital, Dr. Mitsuhiko Koresawa, it is nearly impossible for someone with no experience in cesarean sections to remove a fetus from a woman's abdomen within 10 minutes. Since this is something coming from such an expert, it would seem that the perpetrator may indeed have some knowledge of what to do. What's more, just psychologically, even for the most disturbed individual, it would be difficult to perform such a thing so calm and calculated. There were no cuts that hinted hesitation, worry, or unfamiliarity. There are, however, a lot of counter-arguments to the doctor or medical student theory. The wound was just so different from an actual C-section procedure. According to the aforementioned Dr. Kuresawa, a C-section involves a horizontal incision. If a vertical incision is required for whatever reason, the incision is made downward from just below the navel to avoid damaging the liver. Therefore, while done skillfully, the perpetrator made the incision in the complete opposite way, doing it not just vertically, but also bottom to top instead of top to bottom. The perpetrator's cut was also much larger than necessary. The incision through layers of flesh and muscle would also have needed to be spaced out by around 10 centimeters, but the perpetrator didn't do that either. Therefore, although there was some suspicion and even clues that pointed to a medical background, it was eventually ruled out as a possible line of inquiry. Another theory is that the culprit is known Nagoya murderer Akihiro Goto. This is quite an unknown criminal even in Japan, and there is little information on him at all. I won't go into too much detail on his crimes since that's not the focus of this video, but in the early 2000s, just over a decade after this incident, he began robbing from young women, creeping into their homes to steal cash or stealing handbags from women walking the street. It sadly escalated way more than such actions, however. In 2011, the then 46-year-old Akihiro was brought in for questioning for being involved in the disappearance and death of her co-worker, convenience store clerk 44-year-old Mayumi Nagase. He had anonymously tipped off the authorities of the location of the body, then skeletal, on a mountainside, going as far to call them and write a note at the scene. Akihiro was acting very suspiciously, and when the police checked his phone after he voluntarily submitted it during an interview, they made some shocking discoveries. He'd been photographing women, not just your everyday pictures however. They were images of women who were no longer living, and they had their stomachs opened up. Each image had comments about what the photographer, Akihiro Goto, had done in the process of taking them. After taking his DNA sample, it was matched to a cold case crime in Tokugawa City, Aichi Prefecture, southeast of Nagoya where Mitsuko was murdered. In 2006, a 24-year-old Vietnamese woman named Rei T. Lee was working in a car parts factory. She had arrived in Japan in September 2001 and was working illegally since her visa had expired. Caring deeply about her family back home, she was sending most of her income to Vietnam and living a frugal life to save as much money as possible. Akihiro was working as a truck driver at the time, and would frequent the eating establishment opposite Rei's apartment. Akihiro would see Rei often walking to and from work, and so started to develop creepy one-sided feelings for her. He would sometimes peek into the windows of her apartment, and even tried opening her door several times, shaking the door handle. On the night of the 28th of July 2006, Akihiro trespassed into Rei's apartment unnoticed. It had accidentally been left unlocked. With a lead pipe he'd fetched from his truck, he callously struck her several times on the head before using a rope on her neck. After her passing, Akihiro was quoted as saying upon his capture, "I thought about cutting her stomach after killing her." He grabbed a fruit knife from her apartment, made a number of 10cm cuts which opened up, and he then took photographs. If things couldn't get even more disgusting, he also licked around the area of the wounds, which left saliva samples that were used to further link him to the crime. Police searched Akihiro's home and found the fruit knife he had taken from Rei's apartment. Upon questioning, he said, "There is no doubt I killed Rei. I am very sorry for what I did." As for the body of his co-worker, 44-year-old Mayumi Nagase, while it couldn't be verified, it seems that some pictures on Akihiro's phone were of her body as well. Akihiro's DNA was also found on Mayumi's discarded clothes located near her remains. The reason I'm sharing this incident with you is because there are a number of parallels that can be drawn between this and Mitsuko's tragic end. In fact, there are so many that a lot of people investigating Mitsuko's death feel that Akihiro is the culprit. The crimes happened in the same area of Japan. He robbed women. He checked out the apartments and tried to open doors. He didn't assault them. He had a very morbid curiosity. He took the weapon with him, and strangulation was the method of ending his victims' lives. No DNA or prints were found in Mitsuko's case, so it was completely possible, and Akihiro actually matches the description of the neighbors a little, especially his round face. People who commit such things rarely do this once. Quoting on the case, the authorities said that those who get excited by toying with the bodies cannot forget the pleasure they feel once they have caused the death, leading to repeated offenses. There is a high probability they will do something again. However, if Akihiro was responsible, he wasn't so careful when he attacked these two poor victims as he was when he attacked Mitsuko, leaving evidence behind at the scenes. The murder of the Vietnamese woman also seemed to have had some further sinister element, given how he had licked her. Were he responsible, it could be argued that it was an escalation of his previous crime with Mitsuko, however. In the end though, for reasons you'll discover shortly, Akihiro was never investigated in the Mitsuko case. Fortunately though, he was given a life sentence for his crimes against the two women, and remains in jail to this day. Going back to Mitsuko's case, the Aichi Prefecture Force had a tough time with this investigation. With little evidence and little information from witnesses, it didn't leave much for them to go on. They relentlessly pursued every single lead and did their best to investigate locals in the area who had expressed bizarre interests, but ultimately nothing concrete came to light. Since it happened close to Toda Station, they expanded their investigation to other areas along the Kintetsu line, including as far as Osaka and Nara. They compiled a list of 1,000 individuals, but narrowed it down to 30 particularly suspicious people who had previously displayed troubling characteristics. However, one by one, they were all ruled out. Over the course of a year from March 1988 to March 1989, a total of 17,500 investigators had worked on the case at some point, and 104 tips had come in. All were thoroughly investigated, but all led to dead ends. It was actually during this time that a tip came from Mitsuko's family member. A few days before her death, Mitsuko had discussed meeting a door-to-door salesman who was selling underwear. She had received a phone call from this person and agreed for him to come over. The investigation team took this tip extremely seriously, questioning approximately 40 businesses in the area. Sadly, again, it led nowhere. By March 1990, 2 years after the incident, up to 23,500 investigators had at some point worked on the case, with 20 working on it full time. But it was an extremely difficult task. They were quoted as saying, "There is no solid evidence to even tell us if the perpetrator is male, so we're grasping in the dark." The public, especially those living in the area and who have been fearful ever since, were getting very frustrated at the police, saying harshly, "Are you still doing this? Why haven't you solved it yet?" when encountering the police investigating. Tips in 1990 were at 133, but before long they rarely came in, and in fact roughly one a month was coming in, much lower than previous years. The police really began grasping at straws, interviewing 450 people who were simply in the area at the time and could have been involved, as well as 1,000 homeless addicts. At one point, they began focusing on the fact that because Mitsuko was pregnant, that perhaps the perpetrator had a twisted fascination with pregnant women. Investigators interviewed roughly 300 pregnant women in the area, asking questions like, "Have you ever been followed by a mysterious person?" or "Has anyone ever knocked on your door asking to come in or for directions?" This was further spurred by a tip from a pregnant woman living near the crime scene in March 1989, who claimed she was followed home to her apartment. After entering, a man began knocking on her door and ringing the bell repeatedly. Fortunately, she never opened the door, but spoke to him through it, asking what he wanted. In response, he said, "I have something to show you, please open the door." When she refused, he quickly ran away. If this tip is true, there was clearly some strange person walking around the area. This also happened exactly 1 year after the incident in the exact same area, so perhaps the perpetrator was looking to relive the deeds once more on the anniversary. His description, being in his early 20s between 160 to 170 centimeters tall, of medium build, and giving off a quiet impression, were not too dissimilar to the descriptions given by the neighbor. The authorities kept a particularly close eye on this line of investigation, even putting up signs around police and train stations asking people to report others who have a strange fascination with pregnant women, but it seems it didn't really go anywhere. After Tsutomu Miyazaki began his terrible crime spree, the Tokyo Metropolitan and Saitama police forces were contacted to see if there was a connection, but Tsutomu was ruled out upon his capture. While the police were continuing their investigation, Shinichi was trying his best to live a normal life. Because he had to work full-time as a single father, he had to put his son in the care of his mother and father at the family home while he continued to live alone in the apartment Mitsuko died in. Fed up with the lack of progress on the police side, he even began his own investigation into the crime. He did this for a year before being transferred to Tokyo sometime in 1989. In 1991, Shinichi's father, who had donated blood to save the life of the baby, passed away from stomach cancer, leaving only Shinichi's mother, the child's grandmother, to take care of him. In 1994, however, because his son was now old enough and was to enter into elementary school, Shinichi returned to Nagoya to live with his son and mother in a new apartment. They lived close to Mitsuko's mother too, so that she could be close to her grandchild. As the years went by and less information came in, the family began to wonder if it would ever be solved. But the investigators were not giving up, and even began looking into older cases to see if there was a link between them. In 1983, 5 years prior to the incident, there were a series of strange murders where women were being killed before having unusual objects implanted into them. It seemed that the person responsible was not satisfied with doing it one time and would escalate in depravity. Investigators looked into finding anything that could link Mitsuko's case to this series of crimes, but with no evidence there was nothing to compare to these strange acts other than their bizarre nature. Over the years, with no large developments, people slowly started to forget about this case. There was a time when a bouquet of flowers was left anonymously at the apartment, which caused the family concern and also sparked an investigation, but the person, a local woman, was tracked down, and it was proven that she was completely unrelated. In the mid to late 90s, Shinichi decided to quit his job and prepared to create a business with his friend in Hawaii, USA. In 1999, 10 years after the incident, Shinichi, his mother, and his son packed up their lives and moved to the US state. Mitsuko's ashes were brought along too and buried in Mililani Memorial Park so that she could continue to be close to her son, who was then a 6th grade elementary school student. The son at this point still didn't know why he didn't have a mother. It seemed that the family were trying to put their horrible past behind them and look to the future. In 2003, the statute of limitations was approaching. At that time in Japan, there was a statute of limitations even for murder, and while it has now been abolished, it was set at 15 years back then, so time was running out. Mitsuko's father was quoted as saying in February of this year, just before the expiry, "It's okay if we continue to suffer without the criminal being arrested, but when I imagine the perpetrator living a normal, comfortable life in society after the statute of limitations expires, I feel sorry for my daughter and detest the statute of limitations for that." He went on to say that he would like to think that the perpetrator must have been tormented by guilt for the past 15 years. He further stated that he hopes he can move on, but it will linger in his heart forever. He also hopes that when his grandson, Mitsuko's son, understands the truth, it will not affect his life. In the same month that Mitsuko's father spoke, a senior investigator at the time expressed his regret in an interview with the Chunichi Shimbun, stating, "Looking back, this was not a case where the perpetrator was connected to the victim, and nothing like grudges or personal feelings existed between them. The investigation was spread so large that it is extremely unfortunate that we were unable to identify a suspect. By the end, up to 40,000 officers over 15 years had been on the case at some point. At midnight on the 17th of March 2003, it hit the statute of limitations, and the investigation was closed. While some lines of inquiry continued in case the criminal was involved in other crimes or fled overseas, the investigation officially stopped that day, and no more police were assigned to the case. Just like that, no justice, no answers, nothing. The evil person responsible probably lives on today, living a normal, happy life free in society, free of consequence, all while the family continues to suffer, live on with the horrible memories. I can't even imagine the feeling. There is, however, one thing left to discuss, one thing that came up just before the case hit the statute of limitations, a blog post written in 2001. Before I get into it, however, I want to make it very clear that there is no credible evidence to validate the following account. It was written online anonymously, and while I think there are some things in it that make it seem very real, such as extensive knowledge of the area and crime, as well as the fact that the police were so persistent in wiping it from the internet, none of the claims can be proven at all, so take it with a large pinch of salt. Since the writer used real people's names, I'll change them. It was also a very long account, so I will only discuss points I find relevant. And for ease of understanding, I'll change my speech to first person, but please note that these are not my words. It was about 2 years after March 1988 when the pregnant wife incident occurred. My house was located near the scene, where I lived with my parents. My father worked as an engineer for many years, but on the 15th of February 1990, he was diagnosed with terminal cancer and admitted to a nearby hospital. My mother decided to stay overnight in his hospital room to be by his side. With my parents out of the home, I was alone. On the 16th of February, just after 6 p.m, the doorbell to my home rang. I answered the intercom and heard the voice of a young man saying, "I'm here to collect your insurance money." I thought it was strange since insurance premiums are usually debited from your account automatically. Perhaps he was actually a salesman pretending to collect money so I would open the door and he'd try to sell me something. My front door was an old-fashioned, swinging glass door with no chain lock on it. I couldn't risk opening the door to someone suspicious, so I spoke to him through the door. I said, "I'm home alone right now. My family hasn't mentioned anything about insurance. I'm sorry, but can you come back when my family's here?" I explained this very politely, but he didn't say anything in response. Assuming he was satisfied and would leave, I hung up the intercom, but then the doorbell started ringing. I picked up the intercom and said, "Hello?" But the man stayed silent and didn't reply. No matter how many times I spoke, he remained silent. He didn't say a word, but kept ringing the doorbell. I felt an indescribable, strange aura emanating from the door where the man was. I had a feeling something was very, very wrong, so in a state of panic, I rushed to the phone. I dialed 110 and said, "A suspicious man who appears to be a salesman has been ringing my doorbell for a while now, as if trying to get me to open up." The room where the phone was located was beside the front door, so the man realized I was making a call and disappeared. The responder on the other end asked for my name and address, and when she heard it, it was as though she remembered the pregnant woman incident since I lived in the exact same area. After making the report, I glanced at the clock and it showed 6:20 p.m. The police station is located only 500 meters away, and it took 15 minutes for 2 officers to arrive. When I told one officer that the man had fled, he took out his radio and began talking to someone. It seemed like he was asking for instructions. After talking, he said, "We're leaving," and they sped away just like that. I remember thinking this was odd. I live in a farmhouse with roughly 150 square meters of land. There are 2 barns and it's full of trees. The mysterious man could have been hiding, but the police made no attempt to search the area and were gone in just 3 minutes. After the officers left, I called my sister who lived nearby. As I was explaining the situation to her, the suspicious man returned to my front door again. He called out in a loud voice, "I am from Volunteer Company A. We are here to collect money," as if trying to not be suspicious, but he banged on the glass door with such force that it sounded like it was going to break. I asked my sister to come help and called the police again. After doing so, I shouted at the crazed man, "I've called the police." Fearing he might break the glass and gain entry, I fled to the second floor. I thought that the police that had just left would come back immediately. Looking out the window, I could see the man sneaking away. His figure was clearly visible from the light on the front of the house. As he left, he looked back at the front door. At that moment, I clearly saw that he was wearing a thin white V-neck cardigan, hardly the kind of clothing you'd expect someone to wear on a late winter evening. And despite claiming to be a money collector, he wasn't holding anything. He went to the barn and hid. As he did, my sister and her husband came running to the home. My brother-in-law asked. A young man sped off on a bicycle from behind the barn next door. He was suspicious, right? My brother-in-law further stated he was wearing a brown jacket. When the first call to the police was made, it seemed like he hid in the barn. I suppose once he heard the sounds of them leaving, he assumed it was safe, took off his jacket, and came back to my house. It took a very long time for the police to arrive a second time. They arrived at 7:15 p.m, some 40 minutes later. A young man arrived completely different from those who arrived before. He immediately began to explain his lateness, saying a different incident had occurred, and so he had come from a farther away station while others were busy. I was confused when he said this. The first officers had rushed over immediately, and in a rural area like this, does anything more serious than an arrest of a potential murderer happen? Why would he immediately start making excuses for why he was so late? Like the previous officers, he didn't check my garden or the surrounding area, and he quickly left. It would be a week later until I understood what this meant. The next morning, on the 17th of February, I called the Nakagawa police station. The detective in charge of the murder of the pregnant woman answered the phone. I offered to cooperate with the investigation, as I felt the mysterious man might be connected to that case. I had a hunch that the mysterious man was aware that my family were away, and my father was in hospital. Therefore, he must have been someone local and someone I knew. After speaking with the detective, I went to my father's hospital room where my mother told me the following. Around this time of year, young men from a certain volunteer group go around collecting money for something commonly known as insurance. We pay a 1,000 yen premium every year. Could it be that the young man who almost attacked you was one of those collectors? On Monday, the 20th of February, the detective in charge of the pregnant woman murder case came to my home. He introduced himself and was a kind-looking young man about the same age as me. I told him that the man in question might belong to a certain volunteer group. The detective looked pleased, as though he'd been given a lucky break. A few hours later, a different detective in his 50s showed up. He had a sharp, tough gaze and looked more like a gangster than a police officer. He never introduced himself, so I will refer to him as Detective X. He said, "I've just heard from the group leader that the man in question was indeed a member of the volunteer group. He came to your house to collect insurance money. However, because you mistook him for a salesman and refused to open the door, he got angry and rang the doorbell loudly. He was not trying to attack you. The man came back to your home because he wanted the money quickly. He was not hiding to escape the police. You were the one who was mistaken. He also had nothing to do with the pregnant woman case, so you can rest assured." The man handed your insurance money back to the leader, apparently furious, saying, "I'm never going to that house to collect money again. The lights were on, and yet she refused to open the door to me. Next time the man comes, be sure to apologize to him." I couldn't really say anything about this, bowed my head and said, "I'm sorry for causing you so much trouble. My mother went to the leader's house and paid the 1,000 yen so she got it back." What is strange is, if the man was innocent, he could have waited for the police and gotten the money quickly because I would have given it in their presence, but he panicked when he heard them coming and hid. The detective asserted that nothing criminal took place, and I feel this was to prevent civilians from interfering in an unnecessary way. Given the similarities, I thought the police would investigate whether he had a connection to the murder of the pregnant woman. My mother found out that the mysterious man was the second son of a family that lived a 3-minute walk away from our home, and that his father had known my father for a very long time and they were on friendly terms. Thursday the 23rd of February. By the way, my father was bedridden as a result of his terminal cancer, and so he used diapers. It was part of my daily routine to wash and hang them in the garden to dry. Thinking about this, I had a sudden thought and called the Nakagawa police station. The detective in charge of the pregnant woman case answered. I told him about the diapers, and that I wonder if the mysterious man mistook me for a pregnant woman and attacked me, thinking that they were for a baby instead. While talking, the detective let slip something by accident. He said, "Are you still worried? Don't. We have been looking into him for a while, but we haven't found any proof of his involvement in the pregnant woman case yet." They had accidentally confessed. The mysterious man who came to my home was indeed a suspect in the pregnant woman case. The police were investigating him. I then called my sister and said, "The mysterious man is a suspect. I just heard from the detective. Apparently, he had been a suspect before I reported him. The detective that came to my house before must have been trying to silence me so that I don't interfere. We have to be careful not to be attacked again." Then I gazed out of the window. I saw Detective X come running up to my house with a pale face. Behind him was another officer. I opened the front door and he immediately began talking to me in a panicked voice. No, no, no. That man is not the culprit. Absolutely not. He's just a debt collector. He's very angry because he wouldn't open the door. There's nothing suspicious. You don't need to worry. He didn't see the diapers and so come to attack you. I had no idea what was going on and how he knew this information, but then it hit me. Detective X was staking out the area and tapping my phone. He was in a panic not because the lead detective had let slip the mysterious man was a suspect in the pregnant woman case, but also because I had immediately called my sister to spread the word. I cannot be certain, but he must have because of the way he talked, such as shouting no, and other things as if to refute what I had discussed with my sister. All this made me think about the day the mysterious man showed up. It seemed the detective who received the call was excited, seeing an opportunity. There was a high possibility that the man in question was a suspect that they had been investigating for the past 2 years, but had not yet been able to arrest him due to the lack of evidence. Maybe they thought that there was a chance to arrest him on a different charge so that they could dig into him more for the pregnant woman case. However, according to the nature of the call, the man had only been ringing the doorbell and had not yet begun any crime that would warrant an arrest. Even if they rushed to the scene immediately, it would only end up preventing further harm from occurring. So it seems the detective waited for more than 10 minutes after receiving the call. Maybe he thought that if he waited for 10 minutes, surely some serious crime would take place that would allow them to make an arrest. I went to tell my sister about everything in person, but she didn't believe me. Little did I know, she called the Nakagawa police station to ask them if they were really tapping my phones as I told her. They of course denied it, and also denied that the neighbor was a suspect in the pregnant woman case. Wiretapping is actually banned by the Japanese constitution. My brother came to town to visit our father, and I also told him what was going on. Worried, he called the station too. The police simply told him, "It's a confidential investigation," and spoke of nothing else. However, my brother also received a second secret call from the detective later on. He was quite serious to my brother, saying, "That night, your sister was very rude to the man, and there is a possibility he will become angry and put your sister's life in danger. You should be on your guard for this. However, you absolutely must keep this secret from your sisters." But there's more. Apparently, Detective X and the pregnant woman detective showed up to my sister's house in person that same day. Laughing carefree, they apparently repeated that the man had nothing to do with the murder. It seems that the detectives were concerned that information about the mysterious man being a suspect in the other case would leak. If the man knew the police were onto him, he might be extra careful and so make it harder for them to arrest him. But the police made me feel as though I was the one in the wrong, portraying me as a delusional woman who had caused offense to others, and all this was happening while my father was on his deathbed. The evening of the 7th of March. My brother had just left the family house to return to his apartment when I heard a loud bang at the back door. The dog started barking towards it and didn't stop even after 10 minutes. Was something hiding there? The mysterious man. I called my sister, and both she and her husband came over. They let me stay at their home that night. The following day, my brother told me something disturbing. The truth is, when I was about to leave in my car, I saw a young man peering into the house. I got out of the car to try and grab him, but he quickly turned his bike around and fled. Even though I was against talking to the detectives, my brother insisted that I did. The detective told me it must be a misunderstanding, but when I told him that some construction materials had piled up around the fence that made it easy to climb over, his tone changed as though something had come over him. He told me he would come over tomorrow. Detective X came the next day along with a younger officer, and seemed embarrassed about how he had acted before when he came shouting at my house. I decided to take advantage of his feelings and asked why the police were so late on the night I first called the mysterious man. He gave the exact same excuse as the police had before immediately. And so that is when I knew that they had ordered the police to say that to me and that this was a lie. Realizing what I was doing, he scornfully said, "Call the police immediately instead of waiting when something suspicious happens," and left. Frustrated, I called the police station and spoke to the detective in charge of the pregnant woman case. He was actually a very nice officer. I asked him to give me Detective X's name, and he replied with, "I'll contact you about that later." However, Detective X came rushing to my home again. He thrust his police ID at my mother and said, "That man has nothing to do with the pregnant woman case. If you keep making a fuss, he'll sue you for defamation and it will cost you a lot of money. Make sure you tell your daughter that." But I'd done nothing defamatory. All I asked for was the detective's name. In the end, I wrote a letter to the police, stating that I will keep quiet about what they are doing for now, but I've made arrangements to make public their actions with me and the details of the mysterious man if I were ever to be harmed. A few days later, I saw the police riding by my home often. When they saw me, they sped away as though they knew they had been spotted. I saw them 6 or 7 times. The 4th of May, I heard a loud bang from the back door again and called the police immediately. The dog kept barking at the door. I told them to tell the detective in charge of the pregnant woman case. The responder said they would send someone immediately, but were suspicious about why I asked for that detective. Sure enough, 3 minutes later, some officers arrived. One seemed to mock me, saying, "It's the woman causing a fuss about claiming an innocent man is involved in the murder of the pregnant woman," before the other calmed him down. It seems the sound I heard on the 7th of March may have just been a cat after all, and the man my brother saw quickly ride away, just a police officer who'd been staking out my house. It doesn't change what happened with the mysterious man, however. The next day, my father passed away from cancer. At the wake, while decorating the altar at our home, a neighbor arrived bearing a large gift for condolences. The neighbor said, "This is from Mr. Z. He asked me to deliver it to you specifically. Mr. Z is the mysterious man's father." I wondered why he hadn't personally come. We couldn't return the gift but accepted it in silence. Mr. Z didn't show up for the funeral either, despite being in good health. But I knew that his son was the one responsible for the pregnant woman case, and I knew that the family knew he was responsible too. I actually have decisive evidence that the family knew he did it, but I'm unable to share it, because to do so would put my life at great danger. What I've written so far is about the events that occurred 11 years ago. However, my involvement with the pregnant woman murder case did not end there. I continued to have various interactions with the suspect's family and the victim's family after this. Of course, I also had various interactions with detectives along the way, and learned and experienced much more about the case. However, if I were to write everything, it would become too lengthy. For this reason, I stopped writing at the point of my father's death. And there it is. Some parts do feel like perhaps the writer became quite paranoid and so might have been exaggerating or imagining things, especially when it comes to spotting police outside her home. However, I feel there is credible information here too. While it's not the best written piece of information, there's just something about the tone that hints at authenticity. After it was initially deleted, the anonymous writer came back a decade later and posted it again along with additional information before it was once again deleted. If it were all false, why would the police even do this? They not only deleted it from the blog site where it was posted, but also scrubbed it from Internet Archive as well, meaning it was really hard to track down. So if it were all lies and false assumptions, why go to such lengths to prevent people from seeing it? There are certainly parallels we can draw between Mitsuko's case and this story, but then again it could have been written by someone knowledgeable of the case. Regardless, I guess we will never know. Since the case hit the statute of limitations and the investigation stopped, little else has come out about the incident, so it is left in a kind of limbo. Even if the perpetrator were finally discovered or confessed, they would not receive any justice. As I was making this video, another famous Nagoya case concerning the murder of a housewife was finally solved after 26 years, and so interest has increased once again in this incident. Since these bizarre crimes happened in a very close proximity to one another, it was thought that they could have been linked, but that seems unlikely now the criminal of that case has been apprehended. There is now no expectation of Mitsuko's case seeing any sort of resolution. I just hope that the family's suffering was eased with the passage of time, and that someday, the person responsible comes forward and gives the family some much needed closure. Thank you for watching my 50th YouTube video. If you liked it, feel free to give it a thumbs up, and subscribe if you wish to see more videos like this about Japan. I know my upload schedule has been pretty bad recently, but I'm going to improve my flow to get content to you quicker.
This one now. Well, I should be able to shit on the boss now, I'll be honest. That being said, could kind of do with just playing at the trap, actually. Also, I'm so glad I put my brightness all the way up. gonna do a couple things here. One of those things being... You got all the perks. How does that work? I popped a perkaholic gobblegum. That's how that works.
Have you ever looked at one of these most wanted posters and thought to yourself, how does someone actually end up on one of these? What kind of life, or choices, puts you in that top tier of fugitives? Well, I have. In fact, I recently made a video covering Japan's 4 most wanted suspects. That seemed to go down a treat, so I figured I'd turn this into a series. And for the second installment, we're heading across the sea to put Japan's uneasy neighbor under the microscope. Unlike many other countries, South Korea maintains an ever-changing list of high-profile fugitives known as the publicly wanted criminals. And twice a year, in May and November, 20 suspects are selected by a committee for nationwide manhunts and public exposure campaigns. They're typically ranked based on 3 factors: the severity of their crime, how long they've been on the run, and the urgency of their apprehension. In total, about 20,000 sheetlets like this are distributed around subway stations, hotels, bathhouses, rest stops, and funnily enough, plastic surgery clinics, places where those featured are likely to visit. According to reports, when a suspect's face is added to one of these public wanted notices, there's a 45% chance of them being apprehended within 12 months. These are the stories of 4 men who have repeatedly featured on the list, and who have still managed to evade capture for far longer than that. Fugitive number 1, Hwang Ju-yong. Bounty, 3 million won. South Korea has one of the most comprehensive and centralized ID systems in the world. At age 17, each citizen must register for a national identity card, which includes their resident registration number, and which is linked to a government database containing biometrics, like fingerprints. This ID is essential for a plethora of activities: opening a bank account, seeing a doctor, applying for jobs, even accessing some websites. Unlike many countries, it's nearly impossible to go a week in South Korea without having to prove you are who you say you are. On top of that, the country's blanketed with CCTV cameras. Surveillance is so widespread that tracking someone's movements can be as easy as following a digital breadcrumb trail. So how is it possible that some of the country's most wanted suspects can simply vanish? That's the question surrounding one man who's been on the run for over 17 years. On June 17, 2008, a horrifying attack occurred in Gangnam, one of Seoul's busiest and supposedly safest districts. At approximately 8:30 p.m., right when people were finishing work and heading home, commuters heard a scream cut through the air. They tracked it to a narrow alleyway just behind the bustling express terminal, now known as Central City, and found 32-year-old Miss K and her 33-year-old boyfriend, Mr. B, crumpled on the ground. A man had stabbed the couple over a dozen times each before bolting across an 8-lane road, barely making it to the other side without being hit by traffic. Bystanders have been unable to get a good look at him. Both victims were rushed to hospital immediately, though it was clear they were in a bad state. By the time investigators arrived, Miss K was completely unconscious. However, her partner, Mr. B, was just about lucid. Fearing that he too may soon pass out, the officers begged him to muster up his energy and reveal the identity of the culprit who had stabbed them. Mr. B groaned in agony, but was able to get out a few words. It was K's ex-husband, Hwang Ju-yong. Miss K would sadly pass away shortly after the attack, though her partner, Mr. B, would miraculously make a full physical recovery. Had he not, had the killer's blade hit his heart instead of missing it by centimeters, then it would have taken detectives a lot longer to begin hunting the perpetrator. Born in 1975, Hwang Ju-yong had spent most of his life in his hometown of Gyeongjin-yeon working various jobs, such as an agricultural machinery broker, a taxi driver, and a multi-level marketing executive for a pyramid scheme. Blessed with the gift of the gab, Hwang knew how to suck people in, gain their trust, and keep them loyal, even while he was scamming them. But he was also hot-tempered, reckless, the type to go off the rails without thinking. All traits that would be his downfall down the line. Hwang met the future mother of his child, Kay, at some point in the mid-90s. She was initially attracted to Hwang, not just because of his confidence, but also his physique. Hwang stood at around 5'11", tall by Korean standards, and was heavily built, with a background in Muay Thai. And yet despite his impressive size, under the surface, Hwang was nothing more than a possessive man-baby. Hwang and Kay married in 1997, though their relationship was turbulent and reportedly abusive from the start. They separated after just 3 years, but reunited briefly for the sake of their daughter. Again, it didn't last. After round 2 of a toxic, unstable marriage, they finally divorced in 2003, with Hwang declaring, "I want to marry someone else." You see, throughout his marriage to Kay, Hwang had secretly been involved with another woman, P. They dated for 4 years, but P eventually discovered that he had lied about being single and having no children. She of course left him, but after the breakup, Hwang became obsessive. He stalked P, hacked into her computer, and threatened her new fiancé. After his new relationship failed, Hwang turned his attention back to Kay, calling her in 2008 and begging for another chance, claiming that he had changed. Kay, now in a new relationship and building a new life, refused to engage with him. But that simply wouldn't do. Huang always got his own way. Choosing to ignore him wasn't an option. And so, a few days before the attack, Huang called the police and falsely stated, "My wife left home, saying she was going to end herself. She won't answer the phone. I demand that you trace her whereabouts and give me her location." When that failed, he hired a private investigator to find her. And when that too didn't work, he decided to use their daughter as bait. After their divorce, the pair had agreed to share custody of their now elementary school-aged child. And so, Huang sent Kay an email claiming that he had lost his job, was deep in debt, and needed her to temporarily take their daughter. He followed up with a 13-minute call to Kay, in which they discussed where to meet. But this wasn't set to be a peaceful reunion. At just after 8 PM on June 17th, Huang arrived at the Seoul Express bus terminal, parked his blue Hyundai New Porter in the underground lot, and left his daughter in the passenger seat. He then put on a wig and sat and waited for Kay to arrive at their designated meeting spot. But things didn't go according to his plan. Down the alleyway, Huang saw his ex-wife, but she wasn't alone like he expected. She had brought company, her new boyfriend, Mr. B. The new couple stood face to face, talking about him no doubt, how aggressive he could be, how they'd need to be on their guard, and he was about to prove them right. Disguised in his wig, Huang rushed towards them. Using a butterfly knife, which he kept concealed in his pocket, he charged at Mr. B and stabbed him 14 times in the stomach and chest. When B collapsed, Huang wrapped his arms around Kay's neck and began dragging her, stabbing her about 18 times in the chest and abdomen before fleeing the scene. Police later found his vehicle, which contained both his daughter and a disturbing array of items: hammers, knives, and a shovel. It was clear he had other plans for the evening, but the authorities believed seeing Kay with another man triggered a sudden, uncontrollable rage within him. After the attack, Huang vanished. Surveillance footage captured the following day showed him behaving erratically in multiple subway stations, traveling up and down lines, stopping at distant locations, staying 40 to 50 minutes at each. This was likely an attempt to throw off the police. Eventually, he called his brother-in-law, Miss Kay's own sibling, and stated, "Please take care of my daughter. I'm going to disappear." He also reportedly called up a close friend and declared in a more jovial manner, "I don't even understand how so many criminals get caught. I'm confident I won't be." And so far, he's been right. He was last caught on camera exiting the Yongji station, and he hasn't been seen since. Detectives checked his so-called life actions, his phone activity, bank records, credit and transportation card usage, but his digital footprint had gone dark. That is, apart from one breadcrumb, which flagged up 3 weeks after the manhunt began. On July 10th, an individual entered an internet cafe close to the original crime scene. This person, a male who went by the name Lee Bom-jun, registered an account using their national ID card. Once inside, he logged into Huang's personal email address. Though the store didn't have any internal CCTV cameras, this Lee Bom-jun was most certainly Huang Ju-yong. While online, he sent out messages to his nearest and dearest, stating that he would never be found, and that he knew the authorities would now be monitoring his emails. The police searched the number on the ID card that Huang had used to register at the cafe, and traced it back to a local female entertainment worker, a term that's often used to describe women who work at more illicit nightlife businesses. It's possible that while on the run, Huang had formed a romantic relationship with an employee at some dodgy establishment, and either manipulated or convinced her to assist him. They also learned that after checking his emails, Huang accessed a recruitment website and browsed agricultural job listings, suggesting he was looking for work in rural areas where people might not recognize him or know about the case. The authorities interviewed his friends and relatives, who all remained tight-lipped and uncooperative. Aware that he had extremely poor eyesight and needed prescription glasses, they also distributed Huang's wanted flyers to opticians around the country, though they didn't hear back from any clinics. Over the years, several people reported that they had seen the fugitive working as a taxi driver or as a construction worker. Most of these tips were followed up on, but in each instance, the individual in question was proven not to be Huang. For 17 years, he's managed to avoid detection in one of the most heavily surveilled countries in the world. How? Well, there are 4 main hypotheses. I'll go over them now, from least to most likely. Theory 1. Something Huang, an avid outdoorsman, maybe in the mountains, surviving alone. But experts are skeptical. Despite treating those around him like disposable assets, Huang was extroverted, social, and had many friends. Criminal profilers believe it's unlikely someone like that could isolate completely for so long. Even the most determined of fugitives tend to revert back to their old ways after a long enough period on the run. Though there's a slim chance they're wrong, the authorities don't consider this a real possibility. Theory 2. Some speculate that Huang was smuggled out by sea to another Asian country, most likely China. Such a method of escape is popular among fugitives, as the local Coast Guard are famous for not checking ships thoroughly, and the South Korean authorities have been known to accept bribes and look the other way in past cases. However, this method is also risky, expensive, and requires a trustworthy broker. Such escapes can cost upwards of $40,000 US. Huang didn't have that kind of money, and investigators found no evidence that he had contacted any smugglers. However, escaping overseas would explain why no trace of him has shown up anywhere in Korea, so we can't rule this theory out completely. Theory 3. It's possible Huang is no longer alive, perhaps having ended his own existence. His own mother told reporters that she believes he's passed. She even said that psychics had told her he fell into a body of water and drowned. Ultimately, even though no corpse has been found, there is a good chance that he really did drown himself in the ocean. And Theory 4. Huang is receiving help from someone. Inspector Chun Yun-ji compared the case to that of notorious prison escapee Shin Chang-won, who evaded capture for years with the help of others. As previously mentioned, Huang had used the ID of a woman in the entertainment industry to register an account at the internet cafe, proving he already had access to someone else's identity. Whether it had been stolen or given to him willingly remains unclear, because apparently, the police were unable to get in contact with the woman it belonged to, something which seems odd, given they must have been able to find her name and address using the ID number. There's also a good chance that Huang is receiving help from family and friends. He may well have been able to charm, or given his size, perhaps even intimidate those around him to keep their mouths shut. For instance, when a film crew went to interview those who knew him, they were repeatedly brushed off, with one of Huang's friends even saying, "He was like family to me. The incident's over, and I have no intention of cooperating with you. If you come over again, I might beat you up." Whatever the case, if Huang has continued to change his ID, avoid digital traces, and stay off the radar, he could still be laying low somewhere in the country. Though given just how infamous his face has now become over the years, he likely would have needed to alter his appearance significantly. In Korea at least, that's not a huge problem. The country's the world leader in plastic surgery, with 1 in 5 South Koreans having had some form of cosmetic procedure done. But though these wanted posters are often distributed to surgeries throughout the nation, the surgeons themselves aren't legally obligated to report on any of their clients. And for the right price, they may choose to keep their lips sealed. As for how Huang's been sustaining himself, he's either being provided for by people loyal to him, is stealing, scamming, or otherwise swindling people, or he's found work using his fake ID. Indeed, experts believe that he's hiding in plain sight, possibly living under an assumed identity as a foreign worker, perhaps Chinese Korean or Mongolian, likely in a place with a diverse population. But what do you think? Could someone really live without leaving any trace for 17 years in a country like South Korea? Could Huang still be out there, blending in amongst the population? Authorities believe so, and continue to feature his face on these most wanted posters, usually somewhere in the top 5 slots. If still alive today, Huang Juyan would be 50 years old. More than likely, he's lost a lot of muscle mass with age, changed his hairstyle, and altered his facial structure. But there are some things that probably haven't changed. Not only his height, but also his distinctive twisted jaw, the cauliflower ears he had developed from years of practicing combat sports, the unconscious manner in which the corner of his lips raise when he smiles, and crucially, his extremely poor eyesight, which has likely gotten worse with age. With so many identifiable characteristics, if he is still out there, someone must know who he is. A reward of 3 million won, or $2,100, is still being offered to anyone willing to break their silence. That amount might sound low compared to the sums on offer in other countries. Indeed, the bounties on the Japanese fugitives I covered were far higher, but the fact that an amount has been announced is significant. In South Korea, the reward on offer for each wanted person is almost always kept secret, and typically ranges from 1 to 3 million won. There have, however, been larger sums placed on the heads of public enemies, usually on those who have made South Korean officials look bad. Perhaps the most notorious figure to ever appear on this list was Yoo Byung-young, a billionaire tycoon, de facto cult leader, and the head of the family that owned Chongha Jin Marine, the company that operated the ill-fated MV Sewol ferry. In April 2014, the Sewol capsized off the coast of Jindo, killing 304 people, most of them high school students on a field trip. There were multiple people to blame, of course, not least the Coast Guard, who sat on their hands and botched the rescue effort, the captain who told his passengers to remain in their cabins, only to immediately abandon ship himself, and the education system for teaching youngsters to be passive and obedient to authority. But when officials began investigating the incident, it came to light that Yu had a long history of financial crimes, and was directly implicated in the negligence and corruption that led to the sinking. But Yu had no intention of standing trial. In his mind, he was innocent, for as he preached to the members of his cult, the Salvation Sect, when someone is saved, they can never sin again, no matter what they do. So by the time the full extent of his involvement was uncovered, Yu had already gone into hiding. A nationwide manhunt followed, and Yu became the subject of the highest bounty in South Korean history, 500 million won, roughly $490,000. After months of searching, the businessman's badly decomposed remains were found in a rural plum orchard in Suncheon. A lack of clarity surrounding his COD fed conspiracy theories, with many believing that he paid off Korean authorities and escaped overseas. Indeed, the person who made the discovery didn't even know the body was Yoo Byung-young, and simply reported that he had found a deceased homeless person in a field. Since he didn't specifically state that he had found Yoo Byung-young, the bounty wasn't paid. Hopefully the amount placed on Huang Juyan will be. Fugitive number 2, Park Jong-yoon. Bounty, 10 million won. Born in 1960, Park Jong-yoon isn't famous in the traditional sense, but in law enforcement circles, he's notorious. For almost 2 decades, this otherwise ordinary, indistinct face has consistently appeared on the National Police Agency's posters. But Park isn't just any old villain. He's South Korea's most wanted fugitive, the main suspect in a brutal double homicide committed back in 2007. And ever since that winter, he's been a ghost. Perhaps in the figurative sense, perhaps in the literal. On the morning of September 29, 2009, in a remote area near Yongwol, Gangwon province, a man scavenging for chestnuts and mushrooms stumbled upon something terrible. The lid of a rubber container, scraps of fabric, and human bones. Police arrived and soon uncovered 2 shallow graves. Inside were the remains of 2 male murder victims, decomposed and stripped of identity. The bodies appeared to have been there for at least a year, possibly 2. One shirt had sleeves tied with plastic packaging string, indicating that he had been restrained. DNA testing took time, but clues came quickly. The clothing matched with 2 men who had disappeared from Seoul back in 2007, a 47-year-old loan shark, Kong Ji Kim, and his 52-year-old bodyguard, Pang Sojabi Oh. Known as the lender and the organizer respectively, the pair had become high-profile figures in underground gambling circles, and the word on the street was that they had been abducted. South Korean police are often accused of incompetence, and they were again in this instance, as had they done their job correctly, those rumours could have been confirmed at the time. Back in 07, they'd found Mr. O's jacket and Mr. Kim's wallet at the exact location where their remains were later discovered, but failed to unearth either body. As such, they couldn't issue arrest warrants for the 2 prime suspects, taxi driver Park Jong-yoon, 49, and office worker Nam Gong-shin, 34. Phone records confirmed that they had been the last people to talk with the victims, and both men certainly had a motive. Park was a habitual gambler, with debts approaching $500 million won, around $350,000 US at the time, money which he owed to some sinister crime lords. As for Nam, he too had fallen deep into gambling addiction, and owed similar individuals about $20 million won, around $14,000. Now armed with hard evidence in the form of 2 skeletons, police finally got the green light. Arrest warrants were issued, and after a 2-month surveillance operation, Nam was arrested. He appeared cheerful as officers approached him, humming to himself as he made his way to work, but his mood soon shifted when the cuffs came out. On the way to the station, his hands began to tremble, and eventually he broke down, sobbing. As for Park, he was nowhere to be found. Nam said little until his lawyer showed up. After that, he stopped talking altogether. But when it became clear that the evidence against him was compelling enough to secure a conviction, he cooperated in exchange for a lesser sentence. According to Nam, he and Park first met in an underground gambling den several years before the incident. It's worth noting that bar a few tightly controlled exceptions, gambling is outlawed in South Korea, but that doesn't mean it's not popular. The NGCC estimates that 5.5% of South Koreans can be classified as gambling addicts. Nam Gong-shin and Park Jong-yoon were but 2 of 2.4 million residents hooked on dice and cards. They also had similar play strategies. You know how you sometimes find people who match your betting style in those places? Nam later recalled to investigators. Well, that was us. Despite a 15-year age gap, the pair quickly bonded over their poor relationship with Lady Luck. Together, they travelled to places like Gangwon-land, the only casino where South Koreans can legally bet, emptying their wallets and dreaming of that one big win that they both sorely needed. And after a chance encounter in April 2007, they thought that they'd hit the jackpot. During a particularly shady game, Park met and acquainted himself with an off-duty bodyguard, Mr. O. Whispers in Seoul's nightlife scene claimed that his boss, Mr. Kim, carried stacks of cash in the trunk of his Mercedes, perhaps as much as 200 million won. Park and Nam had heard those same rumours, and if there's one thing you can take away from this video, it's that money, or the lack of it, can make people do unforgivable things. On December 11th, 2007, Park called Mr. O and invited him over to the semi-basement room that they often used as a gambling den. There, Park told Mr. O about his plan to steal the fortune hidden in Mr. Kim's vehicle. All Mr. O had to do was look the other way, and they could split that money 50-50. But O was a loyal employee. He and Kim had a good thing going on, and he had no plans of double-crossing his boss. But now the cat was out of the bag. Park couldn't just let O walk away. Later that gloomy evening, Park made a second phone call, this time to Nam. "Come over immediately," he told him. "We're about to strike it big." When Nam arrived, he immediately noticed Mr. O spread out on the floor, his brains bashed in. Park explained that he had no choice but to kill the bodyguard, since he refused to play along with his get-rich-quick scheme. Park then proposed that Nam help him steal Kim's money instead. Given the situation, Nam felt like he was in no position to argue. Together, the duo purchased string and duct tape at a nearby supermarket, and lured Kim to the den under the pretense of a high-stakes gambling game. Once he arrived, Kim was confronted with the sight of his loyal henchman, O, spread out on the ground. His heart no doubt sank as Nam locked the door. Without a word, Park then struck him with his fist, knocking him to the floor. The duo took a paltry 300,000 won in cash from Kim's wallet, around $250, as well as his wristwatch and a credit card. Park demanded to know the PIN number, and after Kim told him, Park kneed him in the head several times, knocking him unconscious. The 2 thieves tied him up, and then eagerly skipped out to Kim's Mercedes to claim their fortune. A 3-pointed star marked the spot. They popped the trunk, and with excited giggles, opened it up to find that the rumoured cash inside didn't exist. Dumbfounded, Park and Nam then went to a nearby cash point, only to find that Kim's bank account was near empty. What they didn't realise was that despite his outward displays of wealth, Kim wasn't actually rich. There was someone behind him, funding his operation. Someone who understood the risks of dealing with desperate addicts. Someone smart enough to operate from the shadows. Frustrated, Park and Nam filled the empty truck with Kim, whom they had bound with string, gagged with tape, and wrapped in a blanket. Kim would later die from asphyxiation inside the trunk. At 1:30 AM on the 12th, Park and Nam rented a Hyundai Starex and drove around, searching for a suitable burial spot. Their first attempt was near Namyangju, but they couldn't find a decent location, so they stored the bodies inside the van for 2 days while they scouted for the perfect spot. They placed Mr. O inside a large rubber container and left Kim bound up in the blanket. At around 7 p.m. on the 14th, the duo stopped their car on the shoulder of National Road number 38 in Yongbolu, pulled the bodies out, and rolled them down a hill towards a forest. Nam would later reenact this with investigators using life-size dolls. After tossing out both bodies, Nam dug a grave while Park stood watch. However, given that it was a crisp -7 degrees Celsius that night, the earth was frozen solid and extremely hard to dig. Park wasn't satisfied with Nam's shoveling speed, and thus he took over and told Nam to go and keep an eye out. Call records show 3 phone conversations between them during that time, proof that they were both at the scene and cooperating. A week later, on December 18th, further phone records showed that the 2 killers returned to the burial site together. Their devices pinged off a nearby cell tower. Oddly, it was during that rendezvous that Park's phone pinged for the very last time. Shortly after arriving, his signal vanished forever. In fact, every trace of him vanished. No calls, no bank activity, no medical records. Everything from that moment forward went dark. Even more unsettling is that something else disappeared along with Park. The rubber container that had been used to transport O's body. When police later revisited the burial site, the lid was still there, but the tub itself was gone. It's hard to imagine how someone could erase themselves so completely, especially in a country like South Korea. Over the years, certain rumors have swirled that Park escaped to the Philippines, or found work on a deep-sea fishing vessel, or hid amongst some fringe religious group. One internet livestream even featured a taxi driver who looked eerily like him. Indeed, it is possible that Park had planned his escape from the beginning. He may have used burner phones, switched to a cash-based lifestyle, made a full identity change. But while some think that Park vanished on his own terms, others have a darker theory. That Park Jong-yoon ended up in that same rubber container as Mr. O. That his own accomplice, Nam, killed him. Some investigators speculate that tensions may have built up between the pair of desperados. Park, who was the elder of the two, was likely the dominant force in the partnership, and probably ordered his submissive partner around. After committing murder, and failing to gain financially from it, Nam's resentment, or perhaps fear, may have reached a breaking point. Nam, of course, denied silencing Park, insisting that he met with him several times after his supposed disappearance. However, his responses grew vague under questioning. Nam no doubt played down his own involvement in the caper, painting the now absent Park as the mastermind, and himself as an unwilling accomplice. But what if Nam was actually the main culprit? The ringleader who ordered Park around to do his bidding? The one who invited Mr. O and Mr. Kim over to the den that night in order to slaughter them? The one who found a perfect scapegoat? Could it be that he's a man so devoid of feeling that he ended the life of his partner and closest friend just to cover his own tracks, and then, after being caught, was more than happy to pin the blame squarely on his own victim? Without Park to share his side of the story, prosecutors had little else but Nam's version of events to go on, and so he was only charged with the robbery and manslaughter of Mr. Kim, and not Mr. O. Nam was sentenced to a mere 15 years in prison by the Seoul Eastern District Court. He was released on November 28, 2024, and many people can't help but wonder whether a psycho who butchered 3 people is currently roaming the streets of Seoul. As of 2025, 17 and a half years later, the whereabouts and well-being of Park Jong-yoon, South Korea's #1 most wanted fugitive, remains unknown. He's 5'8", walks with a bow-legged gait, speaks with a GLR accent, and is described as having the physique of a cuttlefish, and whatever that means. If still alive, he'd be 64 years old today. Someone out there, maybe Nam, maybe someone close, knows where he is. A reward of 10 million won, around $7,000, is being offered to anyone with information that results in his finding, whether he's alive or dead. Though if I were a betting man, I know which outcome I put my money on. Fugitive number 3, Choi Young-bae. Bounty? Unknown. This next cold case unfolded in Seosan, a quiet, unassuming village tucked away in Yongdang County. Back in 2004, one resident, a 48-year-old woman known only as Miss Park, had earned a reputation among the locals, but not for reasons anyone would envy. She was notorious for borrowing money from other villagers and blowing it all on luxury items. Her debts, however, were rarely repaid on time, if at all, which led to rising resentment from neighbours. Many in the village spoke openly about having lent her money, only to be left waiting. But of all of her creditors, none had more cause for concern than 45-year-old Choi Young-bae, a local family man known for his steady work ethic and willingness to lend a hand. Choi had not only loaned Miss Park a significant sum, but he had also co-signed a bank loan in her name. In Korea, co-signing isn't taken lightly. If the borrower defaults, the co-signer assumes full responsibility for the debt, and by mid-2004, the banks were closing in, demanding that Mr. Choi settle the balance himself. And willingness to lend a hand. Choi had not only loaned Miss Park a significant sum, but he had also co-signed a bank loan in her name. In Korea, co-signing isn't taken lightly. If the borrower defaults, the co-signer assumes full responsibility for the debt, and by mid-2004, the banks were closing in, demanding that Mr. Choi settle the balance himself. For a man with a spotless reputation and a family to support, it was a crushing burden. By all accounts, Choi was the kind of person others relied on, a quiet pillar of the community. He never hesitated to help other villagers out with their problems, big or small. But in this instance, his generosity had gone too far. Those close to Miss Park had repeatedly warned her, "You really need to pay Choi back before June 21st. Park would smile and nod along, but their words went in one diamond-studded ear and out the other. It was obvious she had no intention of coughing up any cash. Choi, growing increasingly desperate, would often show up at her home unannounced, but Miss Park always found ways to avoid him. She'd change her phone number, or slip home late at night when the rest of the village was asleep. Choi's mounting frustration didn't go unnoticed by the other locals. June 21st came and went, and residents half expected an explosive confrontation. But instead, nothing. Neither Miss Park nor Mr. Choi were seen or heard from. Days passed in uneasy silence. Then, on June 24th, a chilling confession. One of Choi's friends testified that while drinking together that night, Choi pulled out a knife and said, "By the way, I killed Miss Park. I'll end myself too." His friend, stunned, managed to calm him down and brushed off his outburst as drunken bluster. Just the bitter words of a man pushed to his limits. At around 10 a.m. on June 25th, though, a neighbour stopped by Miss Park's home and walked into a grim scene. There, lying motionless on the floor, was Park. A forensic examination would later confirm what the scene already suggested. She had been ambushed and struck twice in the head with a blunt object, most likely a hammer. The first blow had incapacitated her. The second was delivered to make sure she wouldn't survive. This wasn't an act of sudden rage. This was premeditated. When investigators arrived in Seosan, Choi's demeanour shifted noticeably. Witnesses said that the typically upbeat salaryman now appeared anxious, visibly shaken even. Some speculated he was simply reeling from the reality that he'd never recover his money from Miss Park. But given the confession he had already made to his friend the night prior, others believed that he was dogged by guilt. Either way, the police were eager to question him. There was just one problem. He had fled town before they could. An arrest warrant was swiftly issued, and Choi became a nationally wanted fugitive. Before going on the run, Choi withdrew money from the bank without telling his family. He also reportedly got into a serious car accident, refused medical treatment, and called a friend from a nearby phone booth, saying, "Dying is a lot harder than I thought." Police theorize that between the night of June 21st and the early morning of June 22nd, Choi hid behind the wall next to Miss Park's front gate and waited for her to return home. When she did, he followed her inside, cornered her in the living room, struck, and then struck again. For 2 days, he ruminated on what he had done, before meeting with his friend for drinks and making his confession. Since vanishing, Choi's been a mainstay on South Korea's national wanted posters, with this photo of him typically featuring somewhere in the top 6 slots. However, it's been 21 years, and the public is urged to consider what he might now look like. Choi has distinguishing traits. He's about 5'9", wears glasses, and speaks with a Changchung province accent. Several theories about his whereabouts exist. Some grounded, such as him fleeing the country, or living in a remote community under a new identity, and some outlandish, such as him joining a secretive cult, or living for 2 decades as a homeless drifter. Considering his friend's testimony about the situation on June 24th, and the circumstances surrounding the traffic accident, it seems that he suffered from mental distress, to the point where it wouldn't have been strange for him to end his own existence soon after disappearing. And yet, police remain convinced that he's still alive, and that even now, after so many years, someone knows where he is. While researching this case, I couldn't help but be reminded of the Airi Sato incident I covered in my last video. Like that case, it raises uncomfortable questions about justice, desperation, and the breaking point of ordinary people. It's easy to sympathize with Choi, a decent man whose kindness was taken advantage of. A man pushed to the edge by someone who, by all accounts, never intended to pay him back. In a better world, there'd be fewer Miss Parks exploiting the generosity of others. But no matter how much sympathy one may feel, it's important to remember that Choi was an adult of sound mind who made the conscious decision to co-sign a neighbour's loan. A decision he later came to regret, but one that didn't justify taking a life. No matter what the provocation, no one has the right to act as judge, jury, and executioner. And so, despite the sympathy that still lingers in public memory and on internet discussion boards, Choi Young-dae remains a wanted man, and his face continues to appear on police posters across the country. A reward is being offered for information leading to his capture, though the exact amount hasn't been publicly announced. Fugitive number 4. Song Chi-young. Bounty, 1,000,000 won. A man walks into his office and finds blood smeared across the floor, but no sign of his brother anywhere. Days later, that same brother is found stabbed to death and dumped in a septic tank. The main suspect? A quiet truck driver who vanished without a trace and who hasn't been seen in 16 years. It was April 21st, 2009, in the picturesque and laid-back city of Jeonju. That morning, 49-year-old Mr. Lee arrived at his moving company office to start his day, expecting to be greeted by his younger brother, 37-year-old Kwang Hoon. Mr. Lee was the CEO and allowed his brother to sleep at the office. The moment he opened the door, though, something felt off. Papers were scattered all over the floor. The refrigerator was left open. The room was chaotic, disturbed. But before he could process the situation, his phone rang. It was his sister-in-law, Jesu. she said Kwang Hoon hadn't come home the night before, and he wasn't answering his phone. Lee met with her immediately, and together they went to the police to file a missing person report. Then they searched the city. Some might say that they reacted fast, maybe too fast in the eyes of the police, but they had good reason to. Kwang Hoon was always reachable. He kept his phone on, because, for reasons we'll soon cover, he always carried large sums of cash. Later that same day, Mr. Lee returned to his office. This time, with his brother's disappearance weighing heavily on him, he took a closer look around. That's when he noticed something that he had missed earlier. Red smears and droplets. On the floor, on the doorknob, on a chair, the bathroom light switch, even the sink. Small, dark stains in 7 different spots. They weren't immediately obvious, but when seen, were impossible to ignore. Mr. Lee called the police immediately. Forensics arrived, and the blood was tested. When the results came back, it was confirmed to belong to Kwang Hoon. The missing person case was now a potential homicide. A few days later, Kwang Hoon's white SM3 sedan was found parked in the lot of Jeongeop Asan Hospital. But something was wrong. The license plates had been swapped out, clearly a deliberate act to obscure the vehicle's identity and mislead anyone looking for it. A forensic sweep of the car turned up fingerprints on the driver's side handle and steering wheel. They matched with Song Cheong, a 38-year-old truck driver employed at the same moving company. It didn't take long for police to zero in on Chong as their prime suspect. His alibi was shaky at best. April 20th, the day Kwang Hoon disappeared, was Song's wife's birthday. She'd been expecting him home for dinner, but he never arrived. When he still wasn't back at 8 p.m, she went to his workplace, only to find it dark and empty. Then, about 9:30 p.m, Song finally walked through the door. But something was clearly wrong. His clothes were soaked, his body covered in mud, and he had fresh injuries on his hands. When questioned, he claimed that he had fallen. That might have passed as a clumsy excuse, but what happened next raised even more suspicion. At 2:30 a.m, Song left the house again. When the police later asked where he went, he said that he had simply gone out for a beer, but his wife told a different story. She remembered him leaving in a white sedan, one she didn't recognize. A white sedan, just like Kwang Hoon's. Song returned about an hour later. Investigators soon uncovered a deep connection between Song and Kwang Hoon, one that made his motive painfully clear. Kwang Hoon wasn't just an employee of the moving company. He was what's known in gambling circles as a Kong Chikun. He lent money to wannabe high rollers, often fellow truck drivers at the company, and collected interest, usually during illegal games held at the workplace. Song, it turned out, had been a frequent participant. On April 19th, the day before the disappearance, a gambling session had taken place at the office. Song had lost everything and borrowed 500,000 won from Kwang Hoon to continue playing. The next day, he was due in court for a bankruptcy hearing. That April 21st court appearance ended with Song officially declared bankrupt. Under Korean law, personal bankruptcy can lead to as much as 90% of one's debts being forgiven, something meant to help give people a second chance. It's believed Kwang Hoon may have confronted Song after learning about his bankruptcy. The amateur loan shark likely wanted his money back. Some speculate that an argument erupted into violence, and that's when Kwang Hoon was killed. But there was still no body to confirm that. Investigators suspected that Song's late-night outing was a hastily planned attempt to dispose of it. He was gone for just an hour, hardly enough time to travel far. That suggested that the body may be somewhere nearby. Yet despite thorough searches, they found nothing. Without a body, and with only circumstantial evidence at best, police couldn't formally charge Song with anything. The fingerprints in Kwang Hoon's car could be explained. Song did work with him after all. There was simply no smoking gun. And so, to find one, they called Song back in for questioning. This time, he didn't show. On April 24th, just a few days after the investigation began, Song took his wife and 3 daughters to Boanggon and checked into a motel. At approximately 10 a.m. on the 25th, Song told his wife that the police would now be looking for him, but cryptically stated, "Whatever anyone says, please believe me. I was only a witness." She asked him to elaborate, but he said he needed some time to clear his head first. She gave him 100,000 won in cash, around $70 US, as well as a debit card. And then he left. That was the last time anyone saw Song Jiang. Coincidentally, or not, April 25th was also the day of his second scheduled police interview. When he failed to appear, a wanted order was issued. For 5 long years, nothing happened. Then, in July 2014, workers at a construction site just 3 kilometers from the moving company stumbled upon a disused septic tank. Inside, they found a skeleton. It was a male, and the body had clearly been there for some time. The bones were soon confirmed to be Kwang Hoon. An autopsy revealed at least 10 stab wounds on his ribs, with his black jumper having been torn in several places by a sharp weapon. Foul play was now undeniable, but Song Chi-young was still missing. For years, police hoped that Song's condition would eventually lead them to him. He suffered from Behçet's disease, a rare and chronic inflammatory disorder that causes painful ulcers and requires continuous medication. It's not something that can be ignored for long. Investigators thought that he would eventually surface to get a prescription, but no medical records ever turned up. They even searched for anyone in the country receiving treatment for the condition, checking for possible aliases. Still, nothing. He hadn't contacted his family, and there were no signs of card usage or phone activity. It was as though he had fallen off the face of the earth. At this point, investigators were left with 3 theories. First, that he had assumed a new identity and is living under an alias, a theory that feels increasingly unlikely in an era of biometric data, AI, surveillance, and facial recognition. However, if anyone could become a ghost, it was Song. he'd spent 3 years working with a private crime prevention team and knew how the police searched for wanted suspects. The second, that he escaped overseas through an illegal route, possibly to China or the Philippines, a method frequently used by fugitives, though an expensive one that would have cost more than the 100,000 won he had on hand. The third, and perhaps most plausible theory, is that he's already deceased. Behçet's disease, without proper medication, can be fatal. If he didn't get access to treatment, it's entirely possible he passed from complications. But then there's the question of whether he acted alone. Song Chi-yong was 5 foot 4 inches tall and physically slight. Kwang Eun, on the other hand, stood a bit taller at 5 foot 7. But more importantly, he was muscular and weighed around 80 kilograms. Could Song really have overpowered him alone? Desperate, and with a blade in hand, I think it's more than possible that he could have. But then there's that ominous line that he told his wife just before vanishing. "I was only a witness." That could have been a lie, sure, but is it possible that someone else was involved? Just like in the earlier case of Park Jong-yoon, could Song Chi-yong have been forever silenced by his own associate? In 2020, 11 years after Kwang Eun's slaying, the police finally made the decision to add Song to the public wanted list, releasing his name and photo nationwide. The delay wasn't for lack of will, but strategy. They feared going public too soon might push him further underground, but after years passed with zero developments, they finally turned to the public for help. For more than a decade and a half now, Song Chi-yong has been missing. The Jeonbuk Cold Case Unit is still waiting, hoping for one piece of information that might finally bring him to justice. Though with each year that passes, the chances of that happening feel more and more remote. A huge thank you to my supporters here on YouTube and over on Patreon, especially my biggest supporters: George Lopez, Holly Lyons, Alana Pons, Asia Mina, Alicia 1996 V, Asriel Warakai, Adelstein Trusterson, Colin Munsma, Connell Lotham, MZs, Farewell Tattoos Jack Sefel, Gina Valera, Grace Archie, Hamish, John Stuart Muller, Misty Blue Longi, Peter Logdredge, TNS Mum, Terry Ford, and Geokai. Thank you guys so much for your continued support. Remember to hit that like button, and I'll see you all again very soon. Every day, somewhere in the world, someone crosses a border to escape justice. And when they do, there's one organization that follows them wherever they run: Interpol. Short for the International Criminal Police Organization, Interpol links together the law enforcement agencies of 196 nations, from the FBI in the United States, to Europol in the EU, to the smallest police outposts in remote corners of Africa. Interpol doesn't make arrests. Its personnel don't carry guns or chase suspects through airports. Instead, the organization acts as a global nerve center, sharing intelligence, tracking movements, and issuing alerts that can make a fugitive visible in places they thought they'd disappeared. To do that, Interpol uses a color-coded notice system, a kind of international language of pursuit. A blue notice tracks someone's movements and is used when a suspect's location is unknown. A yellow notice helps find missing persons, particularly children. A black notice identifies bodies found far from home. A green notice warns other nations about criminals who may offend again. A silver notice helps trace and seize their assets. An orange notice alerts authorities to potential threats. A purple notice details specific criminal methods. But at the very top of that hierarchy sits the red notice, the most urgent and serious of them all. A red notice is essentially a global wanted poster, a signal to almost every police force on Earth to locate, arrest, and extradite the accused back to the member countries searching for them. There are currently over 6,500 red notices in circulation, featuring all manner of fugitives, from family annihilators to deranged gurus, fish-lipped drug traffickers to smiling human traffickers. And in this video, we'll be examining a handful of them. This is one of the most wanted men in the Western Hemisphere, an MS-13 leader so powerful that he's turned parts of Honduras into his own private corporation. His name is Yulan Archega Carillas, but on the streets and in the prison yards of Central America, he's simply El Porky, a deceptively playful nickname for one of Interpol's most dangerous fugitives. To understand who Yulan, or Porky, is, we first have to understand what Mara Salvatrucha, MS-13, has become. What started as a street gang in Los Angeles in the 1980s has since grown into one of the world's most notorious criminal organizations, with tens of thousands of members across the Americas. In Central America especially, MS-13 has evolved into something more than a gang. Some describe it as a parallel state, one that collects taxes, controls neighborhoods, sells narcotics and weapons on an industrial scale, and enforces its own brand of justice on those who oppose them. In a poor nation with few opportunities, such groups represent a way out of poverty, a brotherhood that can give their lives structure, value, and meaning. And that's exactly how Yulin was introduced to them. According to Yulin himself, he spent his childhood in the 1990s roaming the streets of San Pedro Sula. By day, he stole watches, and by night, he huffed paint thinner, convinced he'd die in the gutter before reaching adulthood. One evening, a sudden downpour drove him to take shelter in an abandoned building, where a chance encounter changed everything. Inside was a young MS-13 member who called himself Indio. He'd been deported from the United States a few years earlier and was trying to rebuild his life in Honduras. From then, Indio took Yulin under his wing and gave him a new name, Porky. Their past selves didn't matter, he told him, and such nicknames allowed them to be reborn in a sense. This older boy not only became Porky's mentor, but a father figure of sorts, and helped him escape a life on the streets. Little more than a low-level gang soldier himself, Indio earned most of his money working at a gun store, where he taught Porky how to repair firearms of every kind. During those long nights at the shop, he explained MS-13's blood feud with their rivals, a group called Barrio 18, and a war between the two factions would soon consume them both. In 1997, while up a ladder fixing a light bulb, Indio was gunned down by Barrio 18 headhunters. It was the first time Porky lost one of his own. Swearing vengeance, he formally joined the ranks of MS-13 and began his transformation from street rat to kingpin. Old Porky wasn't your typical tattoo-covered enforcer though. He was soft-spoken and strategic, a young man who saw MS-13 not as a gang, but as a business, and that mindset helped him become a regional leader. Porky understood that power wasn't only earned through violence, it was sustained through structure, and as such, he didn't just hire muscle. He financed the careers of law students and recruited accountants and administrators to help protect and expand the group's piece of the pie. He promoted members based solely on merit, ensuring that the best and brightest worked directly under him. He didn't over-extort locals, and cut down on random acts of violence to gain their loyalty. That's not to say he wasn't willing to order hits at a moment's notice though. He did so frequently, but intentionally, targeting both members of MS-13 that he suspected of disloyalty, and anyone working for a rival faction, especially Barrio 18 grads. According to informers, Porky would routinely have 18ers, as he called them, captured, and then tied to trees for machete and firearms training. Other times, he released them into the wild to be hunted like deer. All the while, he'd relax in a hammock, listening to their screams, while raising a toast to Indio. Porky's intelligence and capacity for violence helped him rise to the top. Before long, he was the highest-ranking member of Mara Salvatrucha in the country. Under his leadership, the Honduran branch of MS-13 became a tightly controlled enterprise, coordinating directly with Colombian producers and Mexican cartels to move narcotics north towards the US and providing them with elite Sicario kill squads. According to US indictments, Porky personally supervised multi-ton shipments of illegal substances into the states each year, then laundered profits to fill MS-13's piggy bank. That money bought guns, safe houses, and loyalty, and paid for the kind of political protection that makes men like him almost untouchable. On Christmas Day, 2015, El Porky was arrested for his association with criminal organizations. He was sentenced to 20 years. But prison didn't slow Porky down. With the assistance of corrupt guards, he turned his prison into an operations hub, and his cell into a boardroom, one from which he issued orders across Honduras using smuggled phones. In February 2020, Porky was taken to a courthouse hearing in El Progreso, accused of assassinating 2 Honduran prosecutors. He was escorted by van, not by helicopter, as was protocol, a sure sign that some